Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was during my third tour, somewhere in the dense jungles near the Laotian border. The year was 1970, and I was leading a small reconnaissance unit. We'd been tracking enemy movements in the area for about 2 weeks when things started getting strange. At first, it was just supplies going missing from our camp. We'd wake up to find our ration packs torn open, water containers emptied, and equipment scattered. Initially, we blamed it on local wildlife. Monkeys can be clever bastards when they want something. But something felt off. The way things were taken, it seemed too deliberate, too calculated for animals. One particularly humid night in July, I was on watch duty. The jungle was unusually quiet. You know that eerie silence when even the insects stop chirping. That's when I first caught the smell. Anyone who spent time in the jungle knows its usual scents. Rotting vegetation, damp earth, occasional whiffs of animal musk. But this was different. It was a heavy, musky odor that made my nose burn. Sort of like wet dog mixed with rotting meat, but much stronger. I switched on my flashlight and swept the perimeter. Nothing unusual at first, just the usual wall of dark green foliage. But then I saw movement about 30 yards out. Something big was moving through the undergrowth. My first thought was, tiger, but the movement pattern was all wrong. Whatever it was walking upright. My hand tightened on my M16 as I watched this thing through the darkness. It must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its silhouette was massive, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. The way it moved was what really got to me. It was almost human-like, but not quite. There was a fluid grace to its movements that you wouldn't expect from something that size. I wanted to wake the others, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The creature stopped at the edge of our camp, just outside the reach of our dim camp lights. That's when it turned its head and looked directly at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They reflected the light like a cat's eyes do, but they were bigger, set deep in a face that was both ape-like and somehow disturbingly human. The intelligence in those eyes. It wasn't just an animal looking at me. There was awareness there, calculation. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I could hear its breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that seemed too controlled for a wild animal. My finger was on the trigger, but something told me not to shoot. Call it instinct, call it fear, but I knew that firing my weapon would be a terrible mistake. Then it happened. Another one emerged from the jungle behind the first one, then another. Before I knew it, there were 5 of these creatures at the edge of our camp. They moved with an eerie coordination, spreading out in a semicircle around the perimeter. The original one, the biggest, made a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but more like a deep, rumbling hum that you could feel in your chest. That's when all hell broke loose. They moved into our camp with incredible speed, far faster than anything that size should be able to move. I finally found my voice and shouted to wake the others, but by then the creatures were already going through our supplies. The way they did it, it wasn't random destruction. They were selecting specific items, our food, medical supplies, even some of our communication equipment. My team scrambled to their feet, weapons ready, but we were all hesitant to fire. These weren't VC or NVA soldiers. We had no protocol for this situation. One of my men, Rodriguez, tried to approach the nearest creature with his rifle raised. The thing turned and looked at him, then made this gesture with its hand, almost like it was telling him to back off. When Rodriguez kept advancing, the creature let out a sound that was somewhere between a bark and a roar. The force of it actually made Rodriguez stumble backward. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. They moved through our camp with purpose, taking what they wanted, and we just let them. What else could we do? We were trained to fight men, not whatever these things were. Besides, something in my gut told me that if we started shooting, we wouldn't survive the night. As quickly as they came, they began to retreat. The big one, their leader, I guess, was the last to leave. It turned and looked at me one final time, and I swear to God, it nodded. Then they melted back into the jungle, taking about a third of our supplies with them. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, weapons trained on the jungle's edge, but they never came back. The next morning, we found their tracks, massive footprints, some nearly 18 inches long, pressed deep into the mud. We also found broken branches high up in the trees, suggesting they'd traveled through the canopy as well as on the ground. When we reported the incident, our commanding officers obviously didn't believe us. They suggested we'd been spooked by orangutans or gibbons, maybe even enemy soldiers in ghillie suits. But I know what I saw. We all do. Those weren't any kind of apes I'd ever seen, and they definitely weren't men in suits. Their movements were too fluid, too natural, and those eyes, no costume could replicate those eyes. Over the next few weeks, we heard stories from other units in the area about similar encounters. Most guys wouldn't talk about it officially. Nobody wanted to be labeled as crazy or accused of being on drugs. But late at night, around the campfire, they'd open up. Stories about massive, upright creatures moving through the jungle at night. About supplies going missing. About that distinctive smell and those intelligent eyes. We had 2 more encounters with them during that tour, though never as close as that first night. Always at a distance, always watching us from the shadows. Sometimes we'd hear their calls echoing through the jungle at night, that same deep, resonant humming sound that seemed to vibrate in your bones. The locals had stories about them, of course. When we asked our Vietnamese interpreters, they called them Ngoi Rung, forest people. According to them, these creatures had lived in the deepest parts of the jungle for thousands of years. They were said to be intelligent, territorial, and generally peaceful unless provoked. The villagers left offerings for them at the edge of the jungle, food mainly, and in return, the creatures would supposedly protect their villages from tigers and other dangers. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what we encountered that night. I've read every book I could find on primates, studied reports of similar creatures from around the world. Nothing quite matches what we saw. The size, the intelligence, the coordination. It was all wrong for known primates. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those eyes staring at me through the darkness. I can still smell that musky odor, still hear that deep, resonant hum. I've never filed an official report about what happened. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw. We all do. The strange thing is, they never harmed us. They could have, easily. We were completely at their mercy that night, but they just took what they needed and left. It's almost like they were studying us as much as we were studying them. I'm sharing this now because I recently heard about similar encounters in other parts of Southeast Asia. Maybe someone out there has seen what we saw. Maybe someone has answers. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows of our understanding. I saw them with my own eyes, and no amount of rational explanation will ever convince me otherwise. To this day, I can't walk through dense forest without scanning the trees, without listening for that distinctive hum. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods at night, I get the feeling I'm being watched. And for a brief moment, I'm back in that jungle, staring into those intelligent, calculating eyes, wondering what other secrets the wilderness holds. Story 2. We were pretty young back then, just married for 2 years, and decided to take a weekend trip to Logan, Ohio. We found this cozy place called Cabins in the Pines online. It looked perfect for a quiet fall getaway. The drive there was beautiful, with all the autumn colors in full swing. It was late October, maybe early November. The exact date escapes me now, and the weather was getting that perfect kind of crisp. We arrived at our cabin around 3 p.m. It was exactly what we'd hoped for, rustic but comfortable, surrounded by towering pine trees. The owner, an older guy named Bill, gave us a quick tour and mentioned some hiking trails nearby. He also pointed out the grill on the back deck, which got Sarah excited about having a nice outdoor dinner. The afternoon was peaceful. We unpacked, took a short walk around the property, and decided to fire up the grill around 6 p.m. Looking back, I wish we'd just ordered pizza or something. The sun was starting to set, but we had these string lights on the deck that gave off enough light to cook by. Sarah was inside preparing the sides while I managed the steaks on the grill. That's when things started getting weird. At first, it was just this feeling. You know when you can tell someone's watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing into the tree line, but the deck lights were creating this glare that made it hard to see into the darkness. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the fallen leaves. Not like a deer or something small. These were heavy, deliberate steps. I called Sarah outside, trying to keep my voice casual, but she must have heard the tension because she came out immediately. The footsteps stopped. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide, scanning the darkness beyond our deck. We stood there frozen, the steaks starting to char on the grill, completely forgotten. The silence stretched for maybe 2 minutes. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time. That's when we saw it. Between 2 large pines about 40 feet from our deck, something massive moved. When I say massive, I mean it had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was swaying slightly, shifting its weight from one foot to the other, just watching us. I'd love to say I got a clear look at it, but the truth is, it stayed just far enough in the shadows that all we could make out was its silhouette. But that was enough. The breadth of its shoulders, the way it moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't a bear either. I've seen bears, and they don't move like that. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises. I remember thinking about the car keys inside, but they were in our bedroom at the back of the cabin. We'd have to go through the dark side of the house to get them. The creature took a step forward, and that broke our paralysis. We backed slowly toward the cabin door, not turning our backs to it. I could hear Sarah's breathing, quick and shallow, matching my own racing heart. The thing followed our movement, that massive silhouette swaying like it was considering whether to come closer. We made it to the door, and I fumbled with the handle, nearly dropping the grilling tongs I was still clutching. As soon as we got inside, Sarah slammed the door and locked it. We ran through the cabin, turning on every light we could find. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, fat lot of good that would have done, and we huddled in the living room, away from the windows. For the next few hours, we heard it moving around the cabin. Heavy footsteps in the pine needles, branches snapping, and this smell. Even inside we could smell it, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. Sometimes it would get really close to the cabin, and we could hear this deep, rumbling breathing. The worst part was around midnight. We were sitting on the couch, exhausted but too terrified to sleep, when something hit the back of the cabin. Not like it was trying to break in, more like it was letting us know it was there. The whole cabin shook. Sarah started crying, and I'm not ashamed to admit I wasn't far behind. We stayed up all night, watching the windows, listening to it circle the cabin. Sometimes it would disappear for 30 minutes or so, and we'd start to hope it was gone. But then we'd hear those footsteps again, closer than ever. As the sky started getting light, the sounds finally stopped. We waited until full daylight before we dared to look outside. The grill was cold, the steaks burnt to carbon. There were footprints in the wet ground around the cabin, huge, human-like prints, but way too big. They were pressed deep into the soil, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We packed our stuff in record time. When Bill came by to check on us, we made up some story about a family emergency. He looked at us kind of funny, probably because we looked like we hadn't slept in days, but didn't ask questions. The weird thing is, we never saw or heard about any other incidents in that area. I've Googled it countless times over the years, looking for similar stories around Logan, but found nothing concrete. Sarah and I don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes one of us will wake up in the middle of the night, remembering that swaying silhouette in the trees. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them. Hell, sometimes I still have trouble believing it myself. But I know what we saw that night. I know what we heard and what we smelled and how it felt being watched by something that shouldn't exist. We've never gone camping since then. Even nice cabins are off the table. These days, we stick to hotels with lots of people around. Maybe that makes us cowards, but after what we experienced that night, I don't think anyone would blame us. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. Sometimes I lie awake at night, wondering if it's still out there, watching other people from just beyond the tree line, swaying back and forth in the darkness. Story 3. I'm an experienced camper and have been taking Jake camping since he was old enough to walk. He was 14 when this happened, and we'd been planning this father-son trip to Ouachita National Forest for months. As a single dad, these camping trips were our special thing. Usually we'd go to more popular spots, but Jake had been begging to try somewhere more remote, so I figured Crystal Springs would be perfect. Not too isolated, but still giving us that wilderness experience he wanted. We arrived at the campground on a Wednesday afternoon in early May. The weather was perfect, mid-60s, slight breeze, sunny. There were only 2 other groups camping there, an elderly couple in an RV about 200 yards from our spot, and some college kids even further away. We picked a nice site near the tree line, close enough to the bathrooms, but far enough to feel private. The first day was exactly what you'd expect. Setting up our tent, collecting firewood, Jake showing off his new survival knife I'd gotten him for his birthday. We grilled hot dogs, made s'mores, talked about school and his upcoming high school years, normal dad and son stuff. Everything was fine until about 2 a.m. when I woke up to what sounded like someone going through our cooler. Now, I'm from Oklahoma. I know what raccoons sound like when they're raiding camp. This wasn't that. The movements were too deliberate, too heavy. I grabbed my flashlight but hesitated to unzip the tent. Jake was sound asleep, and I didn't want to wake him if it was nothing. After about 5 minutes, the sounds stopped. I eventually dozed off, telling myself it was probably just a deer. When we got up the next morning, I knew something wasn't right. Our campsite was a mess. Not just the cooler knocked over, but our trash bag had been torn open and the contents scattered in a way that seemed purposeful, like someone had been examining everything. Even our firewood pile had been scattered, with some pieces moved 15-20 feet away. The weird part, none of the food was actually taken, just moved around and inspected. I noticed some odd prints in the soft dirt near our picnic table. They looked almost like bare human feet, but bigger, much bigger, and the toe arrangement was off somehow. I tried taking pictures with my phone, but they came out too blurry to make out any detail. I'm not saying it was anything specific, but those prints still bother me when I think about them. Jake was excited about the mystery, but something about it made my skin crawl. I cleaned everything up, secured our cooler in the car, and we went about our day hiking and fishing. I kept telling myself it was just some local wildlife, but there was this nagging feeling I couldn't shake. That second night I barely slept. Around midnight I started hearing these weird noises from the woods, not howls or screams like you read about in other stories. These were more like clicks, almost like someone cracking their knuckles, but louder, more deliberate. And there was this smell that kept coming and going with the wind, like wet dog mixed with something else I can't even describe. But it's what happened on the third day that still gives me nightmares. We spent most of that day by the creek, trying to catch some fish. Jake was in his element, showing off his casting technique, but around 4 p.m. everything got quiet, and I mean everything. No birds, no insects, nothing. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know how unnatural that is. Then we heard it. From somewhere in the forest came this sound that I still struggle to describe. It was like someone trying to mimic human speech underwater, guttural but with clear patterns, almost like language, but completely foreign. Jake grabbed my arm and I could feel him shaking. That's when we saw the trees moving, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. About 100 yards into the forest, these huge pine trees were being pushed aside like they were nothing. Something massive was moving through them, heading parallel to our position. We couldn't see it clearly through the foliage, but I saw something dark and massive moving with surprising grace between the trunks. I'm 6'2", and whatever this was stood at least several feet taller than me, based on how it was moving through the tree canopy. The movement patterns were wrong for a bear, too fluid, too purposeful. It was walking upright, and each step seemed carefully placed. I grabbed Jake, and we backed away slowly toward the campsite. That's when it stopped moving. For about 30 seconds, there was absolute stillness. Then we heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. A deep, resonating breath that seemed to come from something with lungs bigger than any animal I know of. We made it back to our campsite and threw everything into the car as fast as we could. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. As we were throwing the last of our gear in the trunk, we heard breaking branches closer to the campground, much closer. And then another one of those underwater speech sounds, but this time it had a different quality to it, almost like it was trying to mimic the rhythm of human conversation. I got Jake in the car and was about to get in myself when I made the mistake of looking back toward the tree line. Just inside the forest, maybe 50 yards away, I saw something that my brain still has trouble processing. A shape that was both familiar and completely wrong, like a human outline but massive, with proportions that didn't make sense. It was partially hidden behind a tree, but I could see one eye reflecting our car's lights. Not red or yellow like an animal's eyeshine, but a deep, intelligent amber. We drove out of there so fast I'm surprised we didn't blow a tire on the gravel road. Jake was crying, and I was trying to act calm while my hands shook on the steering wheel. We didn't stop until we hit the interstate, and we didn't really talk about what happened until we were home. I called the park rangers the next day to report what happened. The ranger who took my call seemed uncomfortable when I described the incident. He said they'd look into it, but also mentioned that that section of the forest has had unusual activity reports before. When I pressed him for details, he changed the subject and suggested we might want to try a different campground next time. We didn't go camping again for almost 2 years after that. Jake's 19 now and in college, and sometimes when he's home, we'll talk about what happened that day. He's convinced it was a Bigfoot, and honestly, I don't know what else it could have been. I've been an outdoorsman all my life, and I know every large animal native to Oklahoma. This wasn't any of them. The thing that really gets me, though, is something Jake pointed out months later. In all the photos we took during the trip, and we took quite a few, there's this weird distortion in the background, particularly in the trees behind our campsite. It's subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. like something massive was there the whole time, just out of focus, watching us. I still go camping, but never at Crystal Springs. Sometimes when I'm in the woods now, I'll hear a strange noise or catch an odd smell on the wind, and I'll remember that shape in the trees. I'll remember those amber eyes and that terrible intelligent curiosity they held. And I'll remember how something that big could move so quietly, so purposefully, and seem so aware. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what we saw that day in Washita National Forest. More importantly, I know what saw us. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers us too. Story 4. I was working on a project near Harrisonburg back then, and money was tight. Instead of spending it on motels, I'd often sleep in my old Ford Taurus between shifts. It wasn't comfortable, but it saved me enough to make it worthwhile. The area around Quarry was usually quiet and secluded, perfect for getting some undisturbed sleep. That night started like any other. I parked in my usual spot, a small clearing just off the main road, surrounded by dense forest. It was early October, and there was already a bite in the air that made me grateful for the sleeping bag I kept in the back seat. I remember checking my flip phone. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I finally settled into sleep. The first thing that struck me as odd was the silence. Usually you'd hear crickets, maybe some rustling in the undergrowth, normal forest sounds. But everything had gone dead quiet. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was exhausted from a 12-hour shift and just wanted to sleep. I must have dozed off for a bit because the next thing I remember was jolting awake. The interior light of my car had turned on by itself. That's what gets me to this day. I never touched the switch. I remember staring at it in confusion, still groggy from sleep, when I noticed a shadow fall across the windshield. The temperature in the car seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. I could see my breath forming little clouds in the dome light's glow. That's when the smell hit me. This overwhelming, rancid odor like rotting meat mixed with wet dog. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I tried to move, to sit up straight, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like sleep paralysis, but I was definitely awake. Through the passenger side window, I saw it. God, even writing this now makes my chest tight. The face was pressed right up against the glass, so close I could see steam from its breath fogging the window. The first thing I noticed were the eyes. They weren't glowing exactly, but they had this reddish tint that caught the dome light in a way that made them look almost luminescent. They were set deep in a face that was both ape-like and yet horribly human. The mouth was what haunted my nightmares for years after. It was huge, filled with teeth that looked yellowed and worn, like old ivory. The thing's face must have been twice the size of a human's. It was covered in dark, matted fur that looked wet in the dome light. But it wasn't just some animal. There was intelligence in those eyes. It was studying me, evaluating me. I could feel its gaze boring into me like a physical weight. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My body was completely frozen. I could only sit there, heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode as this creature examined me through the glass. The window started to fog up more from its breath, and I remember thinking hysterically that at least I wouldn't have to look at it anymore. Then it moved. One massive hand, and I say hand because it had distinct fingers, not paws, pressed against the window. The glass actually flexed inward slightly from the pressure. I remember noticing dark soil caked under its fingernails, such a bizarrely human detail that it made everything even more terrifying. The creature tilted its head, almost like it was puzzled by me. Its other hand came up and touched the roof of my car. The whole vehicle shifted under its weight. I was certain that this was it. It was going to tear into the car and kill me. I'd be just another missing person case, another unsolved mystery in the Virginia wilderness. That's when my car's engine roared to life by itself. The headlights blazed on, the radio started blasting static, and every electronic system in the vehicle went haywire. The dome light began flickering frantically. I still couldn't move, but I could see the creature rear back from the sudden chaos. For just a moment, illuminated in the headlights, I saw its full form. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, with massive shoulders and long arms. Its fur was a dark brown or black, matted in places with what looked like mud. Then, in a movement far too quick for something that size, it vanished into the darkness beyond the headlights' reach. The moment it disappeared, my paralysis broke. I scrambled into the driver's seat, threw the car into reverse, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I reached a 24-hour diner in Harrisonburg, where I sat shaking over cup after cup of coffee until dawn. When I returned to my spot the next day, because I had to know if it was real, I found massive footprints in the mud around where my car had been parked. They were over 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. But what really chilled me was finding long scratches in the car's paint where those huge hands had touched it. I quit that construction job the next day and moved to Richmond. I couldn't stay in those mountains anymore. For years I told myself it must have been a bear, or my mind playing tricks on me, or a vivid dream. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, that intelligence. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before or since. To this day, I can't explain why my car's electronics went crazy, or how that creature could move so silently despite its size. I've read other people's encounters with similar beings, but none of them mention anything about the electronics or the paralysis. Sometimes I wonder if maybe it was trying to communicate somehow, or if I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I still work construction, but I never sleep in my car anymore, and I avoid the mountains whenever I can. Some nights, when I catch a certain smell on the wind or hear total silence fall over a noisy place, I'm right back there in that car, staring into those reddish eyes. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I experienced that night in Quarry, and I know I'm not the same person I was before it happened. Story 5. I still get chills thinking about it. The weather had been unusually warm for September, and we'd been taking advantage of it with our regular hikes. The first weird thing happened on September 12th. We were on our usual Saturday morning hike, taking the Wildcat Hollow trail. It's a bit more secluded than the others, which is why we liked it. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we heard it. Look, I've been hiking these woods for years. I know what a coyote sounds like. I know what bears sound like, though they're rare in these parts. This wasn't either of those. The sound, God, how do I even describe it? It was like a cross between a deep roar and a howl, but wrong somehow. Like if you took a wolf's howl and played it at half speed, but with this undertone that made the hair on my neck stand up. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. We both just stood there, frozen. The sound echoed through the trees again, and this time it seemed closer. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It was loud enough to make the birds scatter from the trees overhead. We decided to head back, walking faster than usual but trying not to run. You know that feeling when you're trying to act calm but your body's screaming at you to sprint? Yeah, that. The whole way back, we kept hearing that sound, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, like whatever was making it was moving through the forest, parallel to us. I told myself it was probably just some kind of weird atmospheric thing, or maybe someone playing a prank with speakers in the woods, though we hadn't seen any other cars in the parking lot. Sarah wasn't convinced, but we tried to rationalize it. We even went back the next day, telling ourselves we were being silly. That next week was normal. We did our usual stuff: work, home, dinner, TV. But something felt off. I kept thinking about that sound. It was like when you hear a song for the first time and can't get it out of your head, except this was more like an itch in my brain I couldn't scratch. The following Saturday, September 19th, we went back. I know, probably stupid, but we'd been hiking there for years without incident. Plus, it was broad daylight, around 10 a.m. when we started out. The weather was perfect again, sunny but cool enough for light jackets. We took the same trail, but this time we brought our good camera. Sarah's into photography, and we thought maybe if we heard the sound again, we could at least record it. We also brought bear spray, just in case. I felt kind of silly about that at the time. The first hour was totally normal. We saw other hikers early on, nodded hello, watched a couple of squirrels chasing each other up a tree. Standard stuff. But as we got deeper into the trail, that weird feeling came back. You know when you feel like you're being watched? It was like that, but worse. We came to this section of the trail where it opens up a bit. There's a small clearing with some fallen logs where people sometimes stop to rest. Sarah wanted to take some photos of these weird mushrooms she spotted, so we stopped for a few minutes. That's when the smell hit us. If you've ever been around a dead animal that's been sitting in the sun for a few days, it was kind of like that, but mixed with this musky, wet dog smell. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah noticed it too. I saw her wrinkle her nose and look around. Then we heard something moving in the undergrowth about 50 yards ahead of us. Not like a deer or a small animal. This was heavy. The brush was actually shaking. We both stood absolutely still, Sarah's camera forgotten in her hands. That's when we saw it. I've gone over this moment in my head thousands of times since then, trying to convince myself I saw something else, anything else, but I know what I saw. Through a gap in the trees, about 150 feet ahead of us on the other side of the clearing, this thing stepped out. It was huge, maybe 6 feet tall, but built like a linebacker. The fur was dark, almost black, but with this reddish tinge where the sun hit it. It walked on 2 legs, but not like a person. The movement was fluid, but somehow wrong, like its joints worked differently than ours. The worst part was how it moved through the brush. It didn't crash through like a bear would. It was deliberate, almost careful. It reached out with these long arms to move branches aside, keeping its head low. The way it moved, it was intelligent. That's what really got to me. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. Sarah started to raise her camera, but her hands were shaking so bad I didn't think she'd get anything useful. That movement must have caught its attention, though, because it stopped. Just stopped, dead still. Then it turned its head toward us. I've never felt anything like the fear that hit me in that moment. You know how they say humans have this primitive part of their brain that recognizes predators? Well, every single alarm in that primitive brain was screaming at me to run. Its face. I only saw it for a split second, but that was enough. It wasn't like the Bigfoot you see in documentaries or movies. This thing's face was more primitive, more ape-like, but with these eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was something behind them, something that was thinking. I grabbed Sarah's arm and started backing up slowly. The thing hadn't moved, but I could feel it watching us. Every step we took backward, I expected it to charge. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. We'd backed up maybe 20 feet when it made that sound again, that same roar howl we'd heard the week before, but this time it was right there, right in front of us. The sound physically hit us like a wave of pressure. Sarah screamed, and I'm not ashamed to admit I might have too. That's when it moved. Not toward us, thank God, but to the side, into denser forest. But it moved fast, so fast it didn't seem possible for something that size. 1 second it was there, the next it was just gone, with branches swaying in its wake. We ran. I don't remember much about that run back to the car. I know we were both gasping for breath, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The whole way back, We could hear branches breaking in the forest around us, like something was pacing us just out of sight. We made it back to the car, and I've never been so happy to hear the sound of car doors locking. Sarah was crying. I was shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I swear I saw something dark move at the tree line, just watching us leave. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, but saying it out loud would make it real. When we got home, Sarah checked her camera, but all the photos from that part of the hike were somehow corrupted, just black squares where the images should have been. It's been over 3 years now, and we haven't been back to that trail. We tried hiking other places, but it's not the same. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow between the trees, it all brings back that moment. The thing is, I know it's still out there. Sometimes at night, when the windows are open, I swear I can hear that sound in the distance, that impossible howl. I've thought about reporting it, but who would believe us? And honestly, I'm not sure I want anyone looking into it. Whatever that thing was, it seemed territorial, like it was warning us away from its space. Maybe some things in the woods are better left alone. I still can't explain what we saw that day. I've looked up every possible animal it could have been, every logical explanation. None of them fit. All I know is that there's something out there in Wayne National Forest that shouldn't exist, and I hope to God I never see it again. That's my story. Take it for what you will. I know what I saw, and I know Sarah saw it too, though we rarely talk about it anymore. Sometimes I catch her looking at maps of Wayne National Forest, like she's trying to figure something out, but we both know we're never going back there. Some experiences change you forever, and this was one of them. Story 6. It was late October, around 7:30 p.m. I was driving back from a client meeting in Burlington. The meeting had run late, and darkness had already settled in. Anyone who's driven through Vermont in fall knows how pitch black those roads can get. My GPS had me taking Highway 20, which I'd driven dozens of times before. The heat in my old Honda Civic was barely keeping up with the cold. I remember having to keep wiping fog off the inside of my windshield with my sleeve. There weren't many other cars on the road, maybe past one every 15 minutes or so. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, just background noise, really. As I approached the intersection with Lava Lake Road, my headlights caught something moving in the tree line to my right. At first, I thought it was a moose. We get them all the time up here, and they're always a hazard at night. I started slowing down, which is what we're all taught to do. But as my headlights fully illuminated whatever it was, my brain just stopped working for a second. This thing was standing upright. That's what got me first. Not like a bear standing up. This was natural, like how a person stands. But it was huge, maybe 6 feet tall, probably more. The proportions were all wrong, though. Its arms, God, its arms were the worst part. They hung down past its knees, swaying slightly as it turned to look at my car. The shoulders were massive, like a linebacker's, but there was no neck. The head just sort of sat there on those shoulders. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I've spent 13 years trying to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe someone in a costume, though who would be out there in the middle of nowhere in the dark? But what happened next is what really keeps me up at night sometimes. My car had slowed to maybe 15 mph at this point. The thing was about 30 feet from the road, just at the edge where my headlights could reach. When it turned toward my car, I saw its eyes catch the light, but not like a deer's eyes. They absorbed the light somehow, like 2 black holes in its face. No reflection at all. Then it moved. Not like any animal I've ever seen. In one fluid motion, it just covered about 15 feet of ground. Not running, not loping like a bear. More like it just flowed forward, those long arms swaying. That's when I finally snapped out of it and hit the gas. Hard. My Civic's engine whined in protest as I accelerated. I couldn't have looked away from the road for more than a second, but when I looked back to where it had been, nothing. Just empty forest. I kept driving, probably way too fast, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors. Every shadow looked like those impossibly long arms reaching for my car. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a good 10 minutes, just processing. My shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. The next day, I drove back out there in broad daylight. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe? Some sign that what I saw was real. But there was nothing. Just normal forest floor, fallen leaves, the usual stuff. I even took pictures, though I don't know why. They just show empty woods. I've tried researching what I saw. Spent countless hours reading about local wildlife, looking up similar encounters. There are others who've seen something like this in Vermont, but nothing quite matches what I saw. The arms. Everyone describes different things, but no one else mentions those arms exactly like I saw them. The thing that really gets me is how quiet it was. You'd think something that big would make noise moving through the forest. But there was nothing, no branches breaking, no leaves crunching, just that fluid movement, and then gone. I still drive that route sometimes. My job requires it. Every time I pass that spot, my hands get sweaty on the steering wheel. I slow down, peer into the trees, both hoping and dreading that I'll see it again. Just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy, you know. I've never told my family about this. How do you even start that conversation? Hey, remember when I was working late that one time in 2011? Well, no. They'd think I was losing it. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw. Those arms, those light-absorbing eyes, that impossible movement. Sometimes I think about installing a dash cam, just in case, but another part of me doesn't want to see it again. What if it's worse than I remember? What if it's better just not knowing for sure? The rational part of my brain, the accountant in me, keeps trying to explain it away. Stress, fatigue, trick of the light. But then I remember how it moved, and all those logical explanations just fall apart. There's no spreadsheet column for what I saw that night. I'm sharing this now because, I don't know, maybe someone else has seen it. Maybe someone else was driving down Highway 20 one night and saw those impossibly long arms, those shoulders without a neck, those light-swallowing eyes. Maybe I'm not the only one who sometimes lies awake at night, wondering what exactly is out there in the Vermont forests. All I know is that I can't explain what I saw, and maybe that's the scariest part. In my job, everything has an explanation. Everything balances out in the end. But this is a column that just won't balance, no matter how many times I run the numbers. I still live in Vermont, still drive those dark roads at night sometimes, but I never drive Highway 20 after sunset anymore if I can help it. And when fall comes around and the leaves start to change, I find myself looking a little more carefully at the shadows between the trees, not because I want to see it again, but because I'm afraid I might. Story 7. It was June 1995, and my buddy Mike and I had just gotten into riding ATVs. We both worked at the same construction company and had been saving up for months to buy these machines. Mine was a used Honda 4-Trax, nothing fancy, but it ran well and got the job done. Mike had picked up a Yamaha that was probably a bit too powerful for him, but you couldn't tell him that. That Saturday started like any other weekend ride. We loaded up our ATVs in my old pickup around 6 a.m., hoping to beat the heat and get a full day of riding in. The area we chose was about 45 minutes outside of Walla Walla, a spot we'd heard about from some guys at work. It was mostly Forest Service land with plenty of trails, but not too many riders knew about it yet. The morning was cool and misty. typical Pacific Northwest weather. There was this heavy dampness in the air that made everything smell like wet earth and pine needles. We unloaded the ATVs at this small clearing that served as an unofficial parking area. No other vehicles around, which wasn't unusual for that time of day. We'd been riding for maybe 3 hours, taking breaks here and there to check out the views or grab some water. The trails were decent, some technical sections through the trees, a few open areas where we could really open up the throttle. It was during one of these breaks, around 9:30 a.m., that things got weird. We'd stopped at this spot where the trail split into 2 paths. I was checking my map, actual paper maps back then, no GPS on our phones, trying to figure out which fork would loop us back toward the truck. The temperature had risen a bit, but there was still this weird haziness in the air. That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. I mean, forests get quiet sometimes, but this was different. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole world. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing. I remember looking at Mike and seeing that he'd noticed it too. He was scanning the tree line, and I could tell by his face something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, between 2 massive Douglas firs, there was this figure. At first, my brain tried to make it into a tree stump or a shadow or something that made sense, but it wasn't any of those things. It was standing perfectly still, just watching us. The thing that struck me first wasn't even its size, though it was huge, easily 7.5 feet tall. It was how it stood there, completely motionless, like a statue. But it was alive. I could feel it watching us. The way it held itself was almost human-like, but wrong somehow. Its proportions were off. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long. I'm not sure how long we sat there staring at it. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. Time kind of lost meaning. The mist had settled in patches around its legs, making it look like it was floating. Its fur, and I know this sounds crazy, but its fur was this deep, dark brown, almost black, but with these weird reddish highlights where the sun hit it through the trees. Mike whispered something, I don't even remember what, and that seemed to break the spell. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, just kept watching us. But something changed in the air. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up, and it wasn't from the cold. I remember every detail of that moment with perfect clarity. The smell of wet pine needles and something else, something musky and wild. The way the moisture in the air seemed to cling to everything. The sound of our ATVs idling, which seemed impossibly loud in that unnatural silence. Neither of us wanted to turn our backs on it. We began backing our ATVs up, slowly at first, then faster. The creature remained motionless, but its head turned to follow us. Just that one smooth motion, like an owl tracking prey. Its face was partially shadowed by the trees, but I could see its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was something in them that spoke of intelligence, of awareness. We backed up until we hit a wider section of the trail where we could turn around. The whole time, I kept expecting it to charge us or make some kind of move, but it just stood there, watching. When we finally turned and gunned it back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, certain it would be right behind us. We rode hard for maybe 15 minutes, taking turns so fast we nearly wiped out multiple times. When we finally stopped, it was because we literally had to. We were both shaking so bad we could barely hold onto the handlebars. We had ended up at some kind of old logging area, a small clearing with scattered equipment parts rusting in the undergrowth. Mike and I just sat there on our ATVs, breathing hard, looking at each other. Neither of us wanted to be the first to say it, to put into words what we'd just seen, because saying it would make it real, you know. The rest of the day is a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Every shadow in the trees looked like a figure. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. We made our way back to the truck as quickly as we could, while still being careful not to get lost. The whole time, that feeling of being watched never left. When we got back to the parking area, our truck was exactly as we'd left it. No footprints, no signs that anything had followed us. But something had changed. The forest didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It felt like something alien and dangerous. We loaded up the ATVs in record time. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world. Mike and I never went back to that spot. We sold our ATVs within a month, claimed we'd lost interest in the hobby. We didn't talk about what happened for almost a year, and when we finally did, it was late at night after too many beers. Even then, we couldn't quite capture the wrongness of that encounter. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we saw. Could it have been a bear standing up, a twisted tree trunk in bad light, some kind of mass hallucination? But I know what I saw. Those eyes, that deliberate head movement, the unnatural stillness. It was intelligent, and it was studying us as much as we were studying it. The thing that still haunts me isn't the size of the creature, or even its appearance. It's the feeling I got when it watched us, like we were the ones who didn't belong there, like we had stumbled into something ancient and powerful that we weren't meant to understand. I still live in Washington, but I stick to the cities now. Sometimes I'll be driving past the forests on I-5, and I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for that silhouette, wondering if it's out there, standing perfectly still, watching other unsuspecting people who venture too far into its territory. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day in Walla Walla, and I know that somewhere out there, in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that maybe we don't know as much about this world as we think we do. The worst part? Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, did we just happen to spot it by chance? Or did it want us to see it? Was it sending us a message, a warning? I guess I'll never know. But I do know one thing. There are places in those woods where humans aren't meant to go, and things we're not meant to see. I just wish I hadn't had to learn that lesson firsthand. Story 8. It was around 9:30 p.m. on Easter Sunday. With the COVID lockdowns in full swing, I was alone at my property, a 15-acre farm that's been in my family for 3 generations. My closest neighbor is about half a mile down the road, and beyond that, it's mostly forest and scattered farmland. I was sitting on my back porch, enjoying the spring evening with my German shepherd, Max, and my old tabby cat, Moses, like I usually did. The night was surprisingly clear and quiet. You could hear the usual symphony of crickets, and in the distance, the local coyote pack was doing their nightly chorus. My dogs and other animals in the area would usually get a bit worked up when the coyotes started, but that night was different. Everything seemed normal until about 9:45 p.m. I remember checking my phone to respond to a text from my sister when it happened. The sound, God, I don't even know how to describe it properly. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, and I've lived in rural Oklahoma my whole life. It started as this deep, guttural sound that you could feel in your chest, like standing next to a massive speaker at a concert. But then it transformed into this powerful roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was so intense that the water in my glass started rippling like that scene from Jurassic Park, except this was terrifyingly real. My porch swing actually vibrated. But what really got to me was how everything else just stopped. The crickets went silent. The coyotes shut up mid-howl. Even the wind seemed to die down. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. Max, who's usually this fearless guard dog, completely lost it. He's faced down coyotes and even an angry bull that broke through our fence once. But this time he tucked his tail between his legs and started whining, not barking, just this painful, scared whining I'd never heard from him before. Moses, who normally couldn't care less about anything, puffed up to twice his size and bolted inside through the cat flap so fast he knocked it off its hinges. I could hear other dogs in the distance going crazy, not their usual barking, but this desperate, terrified howling. Then I heard the chickens in my coop about 50 yards from the house start panicking. The whole coop was rustling, and I could hear them flapping around inside like something had spooked them bad. The roar lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. You know how they say silence can be loud? This was exactly that. No crickets, no distant traffic from the highway. Nothing. Just this oppressive, heavy silence that made my ears ring. I'm not ashamed to admit I was frozen in place. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my phone, and when I bent to pick it up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were these deep vibrations in the ground, like heavy footsteps, but much bigger than anything I could explain. They were coming from the direction of the woods behind my property. That's when I noticed the smell. People talk about skunk apes and how Bigfoot is supposed to smell terrible, but this was different. It was this overwhelming musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotten, but also weirdly metallic. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I finally managed to get my legs working and grabbed Max by the collar. He didn't need much convincing to come inside. Once we were in, I locked every door and window. I've got this old Winchester rifle that I keep for coyotes and wild hogs, and I grabbed it, though deep down I had this feeling it wouldn't do much good against whatever made that sound. From my living room window, I could see the edge of the woods about 200 yards away. The moon was pretty bright that night, and I swear I saw movement in the tree line. Not like a deer or a bear. The trees themselves were moving, like something massive was pushing through them. The tops of these 30-foot trees were swaying like something was shoving past them. Then I saw it. Well, not clearly, but enough to know I wasn't imagining things. This massive dark shape moved between two trees. It had to be at least 9 or 10 feet tall. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I know. It was smooth, deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite. It stayed in the shadows, but I could make out broad shoulders and a head that seemed to sit directly on them, no neck visible. For about 2 hours, I sat there with my rifle, watching and listening. The silence gradually broke as nature slowly came back to life. First the crickets, then some owls, and finally, around midnight, the coyotes started up again, though they sounded different, more subdued, almost nervous. I didn't sleep at all that night. Max stayed right by my side, growling at every little sound. Moses didn't come out from under my bed until the next morning. When the sun came up, I went outside to check around the property. The chicken coop was untouched, but my chickens were still agitated. Near the woods, I found something that still gives me chills when I think about it. There were footprints. Not many, just 3 clear ones in a muddy patch near the tree line. They were huge, easily 18 inches long, and deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They looked almost human-like, but wider, with 5 distinct toes. I took pictures with my phone, but they came out blurry and dark. By the time I thought about making plaster casts like I'd seen on those Bigfoot shows, a sudden rain shower washed them away. I also found some broken branches high up in the trees, way higher than a bear could reach, and they were thick branches too, snapped like twigs. There was this weird pattern of broken treetops leading off into the deeper woods, like something very tall had pushed its way through. That was 4 years ago, and I've never heard that sound again. The wildlife eventually went back to normal, but something changed after that night. The coyotes don't come as close to the house anymore. Max refuses to stay outside after dark, and he always gets anxious around the full moon. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors around the property, but they've never picked up anything unusual. I've lived in these parts my whole life, and I know what bears sound like, what mountain lions sound like, even what elk sound like during rutting season. This wasn't any of those. I've replayed that night in my head thousands of times, trying to find some logical explanation, but I can't. Whatever was out there that Easter night was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world, but does. I've only told this story to a few close family members, and most of them think I imagined it or exaggerated it somehow. But I know what I heard and saw that night. Sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, I catch myself listening for that roar again, hoping I never hear it, but needing to know if it's still out there. The scariest part isn't what I experienced. It's knowing that whatever it was is probably still out there in those woods, and no one knows what it is or what it wants. Story 9. I'm what you'd call a serious hunter. Not one of those weekend warriors who show up during peak season in brand new camo from Bass Pro. I maintain my own trails, track weather patterns, and know every creek and ridge in my hunting grounds. Over the years, I've taken down plenty of deer, enough to keep my freezer full and share with neighbors. But something changed around 2004, and it's only gotten worse. It started with the sounds. Any experienced hunter knows the woods have their own language, the way leaves rustle in the wind, how branches crack under animal weight, the morning chorus of birds. But what I began hearing wasn't part of that natural symphony. The first time, I brushed it off as coyotes. But coyotes don't make whooping sounds that echo for miles, and they definitely don't sound like they're trying to communicate. These whoops would come in patterns, 2 short, 1 long. Sometimes they'd start before dawn, other times right at dusk. But here's the thing that really got to me. Whenever I heard them, the deer would vanish, not just spook and run, but completely disappear from areas where I'd reliably tracked them for years. Last October, I finally got my answer, though sometimes I wish I hadn't. It was an unusually warm day for autumn, around 75 degrees. I'd been in my tree stand since 4:30 a.m., overlooking a creek bed where I'd spotted fresh tracks the evening before. The sunrise was just starting to paint the sky when I heard the first whoop, closer than ever before. My hands started sweating despite the morning chill. The sound came again, and this time I could tell it was moving. Whatever was making that noise was walking parallel to the creek, heading straight toward my position. I've been in the woods my whole life, faced down angry boars, even had a close call with a black bear once. But something about this was different. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. I stayed frozen in my stand, partly from fear, partly from curiosity. That's when the smell hit me, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, so strong it made my eyes water. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that heavy silence that usually comes before a storm. Through the early morning mist, I saw movement about 80 yards out. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but bears don't walk that way. This thing was striding on 2 legs, swinging its arms like a person would, but all wrong. Too big, too fluid for something that size. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that looked almost reddish in the dawn light. I've spent my whole life learning to control my breathing while hunting, but in that moment, I couldn't stop hyperventilating. My rifle felt like a toy in my hands. The creature stopped near a large oak tree, and I swear it was scanning the tree line. That's when I realized it was hunting, too. All those deer I'd lost over the years, it wasn't just scaring them away, it was competing with me. The rational part of my brain kept trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was someone in a suit. But who would be out here, miles from any road, in the pre-dawn hours? And no costume could move that naturally, could make those sounds that seemed to come from deep inside its chest. It started walking again, and my tree stand creaked slightly as I shifted position. The sound was barely audible to me, but its head snapped in my direction immediately. I've never felt more exposed in my life. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, calculation. It knew exactly where I was. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we stayed locked in this standoff. Me in my tree stand, clutching my rifle with trembling hands, and this creature just standing there, staring up at me. The smell was overwhelming now, and I could hear its breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that seemed too controlled for an animal. Then it did something I'll never forget. It raised one massive hand and pressed a finger to where its lips would be, in a clear, shushing gesture. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. This thing was intelligent enough to communicate, to want me to keep quiet about its existence. Without warning, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning mist like it was never there. But it left something behind. Pressed into the mud near the creek bank was a footprint bigger than any I'd ever seen. I didn't go down to measure it. I couldn't make myself climb down from that stand for another 2 hours until the sun was high and the woods had returned to normal. I've been back to those woods since then, but never alone, and never in the early morning or late evening hours. The whooping sounds continue, but they seem more distant now, like whatever it was has moved deeper into the forest. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering if it knew I was there all those years, watching me just as I watched for deer. I've lost count of how many times I've started to tell this story, only to stop myself. Who would believe me? I'm not some attention seeker or conspiracy theorist. I'm just a hunter who spent enough time in these woods to know that there are things out there we can't explain. That shushing gesture haunts me, like it was telling me to keep it secret. And for 20 years, I did. But I can't stay silent anymore. The deer population in my hunting area has never recovered to what it was before all this started. I've switched to hunting in other areas, but I still hear those whoops sometimes, echoing across the valleys. They sound almost like they're calling to something, or maybe warning others of our presence. I don't know which possibility scares me more. I've thought about setting up trail cameras, but something stops me every time. Maybe it's fear of what I might capture, or maybe it's that gesture, that human-like request for silence. All I know is that I'm not the same person who went into those woods last October. I used to think I knew every inch of my hunting grounds, every sound and smell. Now I question everything. Some people have suggested it might have been a bear with mange or some other explainable animal. But I know what bears look like, how they move, how they behave. This was something else entirely. The way it moved with purpose, the intelligence in its eyes, that deliberate gesture. None of that fits with any animal I've encountered in my decades of hunting. I still hunt, but differently now. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always listening for those distinctive whoops. The worst part is, I think it knows when I'm there. On the rare occasions I still hunt my old spots, I'll find broken branches too high up for any known animal to reach, or strange patterns of broken twigs that almost look like markers or signs. The last time I went to my old hunting grounds, about a month ago, I found something that made me finally decide to share this story. Near my favorite tree stand, there was a deer carcass. Not unusual in itself, but this one had been carefully covered with branches and leaves, almost like it was being saved for later. No scavengers had touched it, despite it being there for what looked like days. Nothing in these woods would dare claim that kill. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw that day. But the truth is, Sometimes the world is stranger than we want to admit. Those woods in Milan hold secrets, and maybe they're secrets we're not meant to understand. All I know is that I'm not the only hunter who's had experiences like this in these parts. I'm just one of the few willing to talk about it. For those who hunt in Georgia, especially around Milan, be careful out there. If you hear those whoops or catch that distinctive smell, don't try to be a hero. Whatever's out there has been surviving just fine without human interference. Maybe it's better if we just let it be. I still dream about those eyes sometimes, about that intelligent gaze that seemed to look right through me. In those dreams, I'm not the hunter anymore. I'm the prey. And maybe that's what it was trying to tell me all along. These woods don't belong to us. We're just visitors here, and some things are better left undisturbed. Story 10. The first 2 days were perfect. The weather was mild for June in Arkansas, and the fishing was great. We'd set up our camp about 50 yards from the water's edge, tucked away in a small clearing surrounded by old cypress trees. It was far enough from the main camping areas that we could really enjoy that peaceful wilderness feeling. Looking back, maybe that wasn't the smartest choice. Everything changed on our third night. We'd had a successful day of fishing, caught several decent-sized catfish, and were planning to smoke them the next morning. That evening, we stored our catch in the bigger cooler with ice and kept our food supplies in a separate, smaller cooler, basic camping stuff to keep the raccoons away. We even made sure to secure both coolers with those heavy-duty rubber straps, the kind that are a pain to pull off even when you're trying. I was the first one to notice something was off when I woke up around 3 a.m. needing to take a leak. The moment I unzipped my tent, I felt something was wrong. You know that feeling when the air just feels different? The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, all that, had gone completely silent. At first I thought maybe a storm was coming, but the sky was clear, stars everywhere. As I walked a few yards from my tent with my flashlight, I noticed our smaller cooler had been moved about 15 feet from where we'd left it. The rubber straps were just gone. Not cut, not broken, just gone. The cooler itself was intact, but when I opened it, all our bread and jellies were missing. Weird thing was, other food like beef jerky and trail mix was left untouched. The cooler didn't have any claw marks or damage you'd expect from a bear or raccoon break-in. I was standing there trying to make sense of it when I heard it. Heavy footsteps in the underbrush behind our campsite. Not like a deer or even a bear. These were bipedal steps, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside. Whatever it was big, and it was walking upright. My first instinct was to shine my flashlight in that direction, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I quietly made my way back to my tent, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Just as I was about to unzip the tent, I heard a deep, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, more like a very low humming or breathing. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. I practically dove into my tent and lay there, perfectly still, listening. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, circling our campsite. Occasionally, there would be a pause, followed by that same humming sound. I wanted to wake Mike and Dave in the other tent, but I was terrified that any noise might attract attention. Around 5 a.m., just as the sky was starting to lighten, I heard something that still haunts me. It sounded like someone or something trying to mimic the morning birds, but it was all wrong. The pitch was too low, the pattern too irregular. It was like hearing someone trying to speak a language they don't understand. When the sun finally came up, I rushed to wake Mike and Dave. We found more strange evidence around our campsite. Branches broken off at heights of 8 to 9 feet, weird prints in the muddy areas, though they were mostly just undefined depressions, not clear footprints, and tufts of what looked like dark, coarse hair caught on some tree bark about 7 feet up. The really unsettling part? We found our missing rubber straps from the cooler hanging from different tree branches, stretched out and twisted like someone had been playing with them. They were at least 10 feet off the ground, way higher than any of us could reach without a ladder. We packed up immediately, but here's the thing that still bothers me the most. As we were loading our truck, we found half-eaten pieces of our missing bread scattered in a rough circle about 100 yards from our campsite. The bread hadn't been torn apart like an animal would do. It looked like someone had taken precise bites, almost like a person would. But the bites were huge, easily twice the size of a normal human bite. I've been camping and fishing all my life, but I've never experienced anything like this. We reported it to the park rangers, but they just said it was probably bears, even after we showed them the rubber straps in the trees and described the footsteps. But I know what bears sound like, and they don't walk upright for extended periods, and they certainly don't hum or try to mimic bird calls. The weirdest part. A few weeks later, I was looking through some local news archives and found reports from the 1980s about similar incidents in the same area, coolers being opened without damage, food disappearing, specifically bread and sweet stuff, and strange nighttime activity. But after 2015, the reports just stopped. Whatever it was seems to have moved on, but I still think about it whenever I'm in the woods. I haven't been back to Bradley Bayou since then. Mike and Dave haven't either. We still go fishing, but now we stick to more populated camping areas. Some things you just can't explain, and maybe it's better not to try. But I know what I experienced that night, and I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, and wasn't any known animal I've ever encountered in these woods. Sometimes when I'm having trouble sleeping, I still hear that weird humming sound in my head, and I wonder if whatever made it is still out there in the White River wilderness, waiting for more unsuspecting campers to visit its territory. Story 11. It was mid-July 2018, and the weather was perfect that morning, not too hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the fresh mountain air. We'd signed up for a guided trail ride through the forest. I'd been so excited because I loved horses, and my parents had finally agreed I was old enough to ride my own instead of sharing with one of them. The guide assigned me this beautiful chestnut quarter horse named Dakota. He was super calm and experienced with the trails, which made me feel safe since I wasn't exactly an expert rider. There were about 8 other people in our group, my parents, 2 older couples, and a family with young kids. We started the trail ride around 9 a.m., following paths that wound through dense forests and alongside crystal-clear streams. Everything was going great for the first couple of hours. We'd stopped at a few scenic spots for photos, and I remember feeling so peaceful just taking in the incredible views of the mountains and listening to the birds. Then we reached this part of the trail that ran parallel to a river. I later learned it was the Snake River. The water was moving pretty fast, and you could hear it rushing over the rocks. That's when Dakota started acting weird. At first it was subtle, his ears kept twitching, and he seemed more alert than before. I didn't think much of it initially, maybe he'd heard a squirrel or something. But then he started getting really antsy, shifting his weight from side to side and snorting. I remember gripping the reins tighter, my heart starting to race a little because I'd never felt him act this way before. The weird thing was, none of the other horses seemed bothered. They just kept plodding along like nothing was wrong. I was at the back of the group with my dad riding about 20 feet ahead of me. I remember wanting to call out to him about Dakota's behavior, but something made me stay quiet. It was like this instinct just took over, telling me to stay still and watch. That's when I saw it. Through a break in the trees, maybe about 100 yards away on the other side of the river, something moved. At first, I thought it was just another hiker. We'd passed a few earlier that morning, but as I watched, I realized whatever this was, it wasn't human. Not even close. The creature was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. If I had to guess, it must have been at least 8 feet high. But what really struck me wasn't just its size, it was its color. Instead of the dark brown or black fur you always hear about in Bigfoot stories, this thing had this weird, pale blonde fur covering its entire body. It looked almost golden in the sunlight filtering through the trees. I sat there frozen on Dakota, who had gone completely still now, both of us watching this thing. It moved with this strange grace that seemed impossible for something so big. It walked on two legs, but not in that awkward way that bears do when they stand up. This was different, smooth and deliberate, like it was totally natural. The creature was moving toward the river, and I had this perfect view of its profile. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees, and its shoulders were massive, like a football player's times 3. Its head sat directly on those shoulders, with hardly any neck visible, and it had this pronounced brow ridge that cast a shadow over where its eyes would be. What really gets me, what I still see in my dreams sometimes, is how it moved. There was nothing aggressive or threatening about it. It was just going about its business, like any other animal in the forest. It reached the river's edge, and I expected it to stop, or maybe bend down to drink. Instead, it just walked straight into the water, barely breaking stride. The current was strong. I remember our guide warning us earlier about how dangerous the river could be, but this thing moved through it like it was nothing. The water reached its waist, then its chest, and then it just disappeared. No splashing, no drama, nothing. It was like it had just melted into the river. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like time had stopped. When it was over, Dakota finally relaxed, letting out this long breath like he'd been holding it too. I sat there for a few moments, trying to process what I'd just seen, before realizing the rest of the group had gotten quite far ahead. I urged Dakota forward to catch up, my mind racing. Should I say something? Would anyone believe me? I looked back over my shoulder, but there was no sign anything had happened. The river just kept flowing like normal, the trees swayed in the breeze, and birds were singing again, though I hadn't noticed when they'd stopped. When I caught up to the group, no one seemed to have noticed anything unusual. They were all chatting about where to stop for lunch, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I opened my mouth to say something to my dad, but then closed it again. Even now, I'm not sure why I didn't speak up right away. Maybe I was afraid they'd think I was making it up, or maybe I just needed time to process it myself. Later that evening, back at our cabin, I finally told my parents what I'd seen. They listened patiently, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. My dad suggested it might have been a bear, or maybe the sun playing tricks through the trees. My mom was worried Dakota might have spooked me by misbehaving, but I know what I saw. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar sightings in the area. There are a few reports of blonde-colored Bigfoot creatures in North America, but they're rare. Most people report dark-colored creatures. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw was something else entirely, something that hasn't been documented before. The thing that strikes me most when I think back to that day isn't just what I saw, it's what I felt. There was no fear in that moment, no sense of danger. If anything, it felt like I'd witnessed something ancient and natural, something that belonged in those woods far more than we did. It was like accidentally stumbling upon a secret that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. I've been back to Teton National Forest several times since then, always hoping to catch another glimpse, but also kind of relieved when I don't. That one encounter was enough to change how I see the world. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should or shouldn't exist. The skeptics can say what they want, that I was young, that my imagination got the better of me, that it was just a trick of the light or a misidentified bear. But Dakota saw it too, and horses don't imagine things. They react to what's real, what's actually there. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I replay that scene in my mind. The golden fur gleaming in the sunlight, the graceful way it moved, how it disappeared into the river like it was returning home. I've never felt more certain of anything in my life than what I saw that day. But I've also never felt more uncertain about what I thought I knew about the world. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Honestly, if someone had told me this same story before it happened to me, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. And maybe that's enough. To know that there are still mysteries out there, still things we can't explain. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained, just experienced and remembered. That day changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It taught me that the world is bigger and stranger than we imagine, and that sometimes the most incredible moments happen when we least expect them, leaving us with questions that might never be answered. Story 12. I've been hunting for over 20 years, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. I know the woods, I know the sounds, and I know how to handle myself out there. Or at least I thought I did until that night in November 2015. I'd been hearing about some promising spots near Lenworth from other hunters, but most people stuck to the established hunting grounds on the eastern side of the mountain. Being the stubborn guy I am, I figured the western slope might offer better opportunities since it was less crowded. Looking back, I should have listened to my gut when the local gas station clerk gave me a weird look after I mentioned where I was headed. The first part of the day was normal enough. I parked my truck at an old logging road turnoff around 2 p.m. and hiked about 4 miles in. The area looked perfect. Lots of game trails, fresh deer tracks, and good tree coverage. I set up camp in a small clearing, nothing fancy, just my one-person tent, basic gear, and my trusty 3006 Springfield. I'd done this hundreds of times before. The temperature dropped pretty quickly after sunset, but that's normal for November in Washington. I'd managed to bag a decent-sized deer earlier, so I was feeling pretty good about my choice of location. After field dressing it and hanging it from a tree about 100 yards from my camp, downwind of course, I settled in for the night around 8 p.m. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was jolting awake to what sounded like footsteps. Not deer footsteps, not bear footsteps. These were heavy, really heavy, and they had a rhythm to them that was uncomfortably human-like. My watch showed 11:43 p.m. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the direction of where I'd hung the deer. At first, I figured it might be a black bear attracted to the scent, but something felt off. Bears don't walk like that. This was more deliberate, more measured. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight but stayed in my tent. The footsteps continued, getting closer, then stopping, then starting again. It was like whatever it was moving in a large circle around my campsite, but staying just far enough away that I couldn't see it through the trees. The sounds would stop for maybe 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and just when I'd start to relax, they'd start up again from a different direction. It was like it was testing me, trying to figure out if I was awake or what I would do. After about 30 minutes of this psychological torture, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see what was out there. With shaking hands, I started gathering wood for a fire. Thank God I'd collected extra before dark. The whole time I was building the fire, the footsteps kept circling, but they never got closer than what I'd guess was about 50-60 yards. Once I got the fire going, the footsteps stopped completely for maybe 20 minutes. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I kept scanning the tree line with my flashlight, but the fire was killing my night vision and creating weird shadows that played tricks on my mind. Then it started to rain. Not just a drizzle, but one of those heavy Washington downpours that seems to come out of nowhere. The fire started to sputter, and even though I tried to keep it going, it was fighting a losing battle against the rain. That's when the smell hit me. If you've ever been around a really dirty, wet dog, Multiply that by 10 and add something, I don't know how to describe it. Musky, rotten. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled in the woods before, and I've encountered pretty much every animal in the Pacific Northwest. The footsteps started again, but different this time, closer, more purposeful. I could hear branches snapping under the weight of whatever it was. The rain was coming down so hard now that my flashlight beam was practically useless, just reflecting off the raindrops. Then I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a roar. It was deep, guttural, but had this almost human quality to it that made my blood run cold. It came from behind me, maybe 30 yards away. I spun around, rifle raised, but in the rain and darkness, all I could make out was a massive dark shape moving between the trees. The shape had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was broad, but in the rain and darkness, I couldn't make out any clear details. My training and experience went right out the window. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare it off. Big mistake. The sound that came back in response was like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It was angry, challenging, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I broke. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 20 years of hunting experience meant nothing at that moment. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight and just ran. I left everything else, the tent, my pack, everything. I ran through the rain and the darkness, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots. I could hear it pursuing me. The footsteps were faster now, more aggressive. It was keeping pace with me easily, moving parallel to my path through the trees. Every few seconds, I'd catch glimpses of that massive dark shape through the rain, always just at the edge of my vision. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only 20-30 minutes. My lungs were burning, my clothes were soaked through, and I'd lost all sense of direction. The only reason I found my way back to my truck was pure luck. I quite literally ran into it in the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The whole time, I could hear those footsteps circling the truck, getting closer and closer. As soon as the engine turned over, I threw it into drive and got out of there as fast as I could on that slippery logging road. In my rearview mirror, just for a split second as I turned onto the main road, my headlights caught something. A massive figure standing at the edge of the logging road. It was mostly obscured by the rain and darkness, but I could make out a silhouette that still doesn't make any sense to my brain. The proportions were all wrong, too tall, too broad, too inhuman. I drove straight home, white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole way. It wasn't until I was about halfway home that I realized I'd left behind over $2,000 worth of camping and hunting gear, not to mention the deer. The next day, after getting some rest and trying to convince myself it was all just panic and imagination, I went back with a buddy to retrieve my gear. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, but the deer I'd hung up was gone. Not just gone like a bear had taken it. The rope I'd used to hang it had been untied. Not torn, not broken, untied. We found tracks too, but the rain had mostly washed them away. What we could see didn't make sense. They were huge, easily 18 inches long, and had a shape that was almost like a human footprint, but not quite. I've never gone back to that part of the woods, and I've never hunted alone since then. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the rain and darkness played tricks on my mind. Maybe the isolation got to me. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. I still hunt, but never in that area, and never alone. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and it starts to rain, I catch myself listening for those footsteps. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still smell that distinctive odor. I don't expect everyone to believe my story, and honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told it to me. But I know what I experienced that night, and I know there are things in those woods that we can't explain, things that maybe we're not meant to understand. For those who hunt in Washington state, especially around Lenworth, be careful out there. And if you're ever alone in the woods and hear footsteps that sound just a little too human, don't stick around to investigate. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 13. I've been bow hunting since I was 15, learned everything from my dad, who was basically a legend among local hunters. By 2002, I had nearly 2 decades of experience under my belt. I knew every sound, every movement, every trick deer would use, or at least I thought I did. It was October 12th, about an hour before sunrise. The air was crisp, maybe around 45 degrees, and there was this light fog hanging between the trees. I was in my favorite spot, a sturdy oak about 18 feet up, with my summit climbing tree stand secured firmly. Perfect vantage point overlooking a heavily used deer trail that connected a bedding area to a white oak flat where they'd feed. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. Usually you'd hear the pre-dawn chorus, whip-poor-wills, owls, maybe some early songbirds. But that morning, nothing. Dead silence. I remember checking my watch, 6:17 a.m. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. Then I heard it, a deer grunt. But something was off about it. I've used grunt calls my entire hunting career, heard countless real deer vocalizations, but this was different. The pitch was slightly wrong, like someone trying to imitate a deer but not quite getting it right. It came from about 80 yards to my northwest. I slowly turned my head toward the sound, careful not to make any sudden movements. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something dark moving through the understory about 60 yards to my northeast. At first, I thought it was a black bear, but the movement pattern was wrong. Bears have this rolling gait, but this thing, it moved more upright, more fluid. The fake deer grunt came again, closer this time, maybe 60 yards out. Then, and this is what really got my heart racing, there was a response from the dark figure I'd spotted. It made a similar sound, but even more off-key. They were communicating. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. I've encountered bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once, but this was different. My instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. I wanted to climb down and get out of there, but I knew movement would give away my position. So I sat there, trying to control my breathing, my bow grip getting slick with sweat despite the cold. Through the growing dawn light, I started making out more details of the figure to my northeast. It was tall, way too tall for a bear, maybe 7 to 8 feet. It was covered in dark hair, but moved with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. It would stop behind trees, peer around them, then move to the next one. Classic stalking behavior, but with a sophistication I'd never seen in any animal. Then I saw the second one. It emerged from behind a thick stand of mountain laurel to my northwest, where the first grunt had come from. Slightly smaller than the first, but moving with the same calculated precision. They were working together, using the deer calls to communicate their positions to each other. That's when I spotted what they were after. A decent-sized doe, maybe 120 pounds, browsing cautiously about 40 yards straight ahead of my stand. She was nervous. You could tell by how often she was lifting her head to scan her surroundings, but she hadn't picked up on the threat yet. What I witnessed next still haunts my dreams. These creatures, they executed a perfect pincer movement. The larger one stayed still, hidden behind a massive oak, while the smaller one moved in an arc, deliberately snapping a few twigs. The doe's head snapped up, and she did exactly what deer always do when spooked. She ran away from the sound, right toward the hidden creature. The speed at which it happened was incredible. The larger creature burst from behind the oak with shocking speed. The doe tried to change direction, but the smaller one was already there, cutting off her escape route. I heard a terrible scream. not like any sound I've ever heard a deer make. And then, God, I still have trouble thinking about it. They took her down with the efficiency that spoke of years of practice. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The larger one seemed to grab her around the neck, while the smaller one went for her hind legs. It was over in seconds. I sat in my stand, completely frozen, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The creatures dragged the carcass into the thicker brush, and I could hear feeding sounds, breaking bones, tearing flesh. But what really got to me was the occasional grunt-like sound they'd make to each other, almost like they were talking. The sun was well up by now, but I didn't dare move. I kept thinking about how easily they'd coordinated that attack, how intelligently they'd moved. If they could do that to a deer. Finally, after what my watch said was 2 hours but felt like an eternity, the sounds stopped. I waited another hour before I found the courage to climb down. My legs were shaking so bad I nearly fell. I left my climbing sticks on the tree, didn't even try to retrieve them. Just grabbed my bow and got out of there as fast as I could while still trying to stay quiet. When I got back to my truck, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. I know what you're probably thinking. The same things I've tried to tell myself for years, that it was bears or wolves, or my mind playing tricks on me in the early morning light. But I know what I saw. Those weren't any animals I'd ever seen before or since. The way they moved, the way they coordinated, the intelligence behind their actions. It was almost human, but not quite. I went back a week later, in the middle of the day with a friend, to retrieve my climbing sticks. We found them, but we also found something else. Weird tracks, much larger than a bear's, and broken branches nearly 8 feet off the ground. My friend took some photos, but they came out blurry. This was 2002. Cell phone cameras were pretty bad. He wanted to explore more, but I convinced him we should leave. I still hunt, but never in that area again, and never alone. Some people have suggested I report it to Bigfoot researchers or whatever, but I'm not interested in the attention or having my story picked apart. I know what I saw, and I know there are things in our forests that we don't understand. Things that are smart, coordinated, and very, very good at staying hidden. I've run into other hunters over the years who've had similar experiences in those woods, though none quite as direct as mine. We don't talk about it much. Who'd believe us? But sometimes, sitting around a campfire after a long day in the woods, someone will mention hearing weird grunts or finding strange tracks, and we'll share a knowing look. What keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's thinking about how long they've been out there hunting like that. How many times has this happened without anyone seeing it? And most importantly, how many others are there? Story 14. That particular day, I'd worked until sunset fixing a wedding dress that needed to be ready for the weekend. I knew taking the mountain path home wasn't wise that late, but it cut nearly an hour off my journey compared to the main road. My parents were probably already worried, and I couldn't bear the thought of them waiting another hour. The air was crisp, and the leaves had started turning those beautiful shades of red and orange that made our mountains famous. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the peaks, that beauty turned eerie. The wind whispered through the trees, making the branches creak in a way that made my skin crawl. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and picked up my pace. I'd made it about halfway home when I heard it. A long, mournful howl that stopped me dead in my tracks. We'd always known there were wolves in these mountains, but they usually stayed away from the paths. Another howl answered the first, closer this time, and my heart started racing. I looked around frantically, trying to spot any movement in the growing darkness. That's when I saw them, 3 pairs of eyes reflecting what little light remained, moving through the undergrowth. My body went cold with fear as I realized they were circling me. I'd heard stories of wolf attacks from the old-timers, but I never thought I'd find myself in this situation. The wolves emerged from the shadows. They were gaunt, probably desperate for food as winter approached. I spotted a large oak tree about 20 feet away with low-hanging branches. Without thinking twice, I ran for it. My skirts tangled around my legs as I scrambled up, but sheer terror gave me strength I didn't know I had. I managed to climb about 15 feet up, just as one of the wolves lunged, its teeth snapping at the air where my feet had been moments before. My hands were shaking so badly I had to wrap my arms around the trunk to stay steady. The wolves circled the tree, occasionally jumping up against the trunk. I knew wolves couldn't climb, but that didn't stop my imagination from running wild. What if they waited me out? I couldn't stay in this tree all night. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and my family would be frantic. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I clung to that tree. My fingers were growing numb from the cold, and my legs cramped from maintaining my awkward position. The wolves showed no signs of leaving. If anything, they seemed to grow more agitated, pacing faster and letting out occasional growls. Then something changed. The wolves suddenly went quiet. Not just quiet, but completely still. At first, I thought this was a good sign, but then I noticed how their ears were pressed flat against their heads. They were staring intently at something in the darkness beyond my view. That's when I felt it before I saw it. A presence that made the air feel heavy and wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my chest tightened with a primal kind of fear I'd never experienced before. Something was coming. Through the darkness, a figure emerged that made my blood run cold. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its outline was dark and massive, moving with an unnatural smoothness that made it seem almost like a shadow coming to life. The moonlight barely seemed to touch it, as if the darkness clung to its form. The wolves backed away, their tails tucked between their legs. They didn't run. It was like they couldn't, like they were trapped between their fear of this thing and some kind of awful fascination. The figure moved closer to my tree with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall was nearly silent despite its size, which somehow made it even more terrifying. As it passed beneath my tree, I stopped breathing. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant, but wild, like wet earth and old leaves and something else I couldn't identify. I pressed myself against the trunk, praying it wouldn't look up. I could hear my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would hear it too. The creature, because I knew now it wasn't human, paused briefly under my tree. I could feel its presence directly below me, and in that moment I was absolutely certain it knew I was there. But it didn't look up. It just stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then continued walking with that same purposeful stride. The wolves scattered as it approached, disappearing into the darkness like smoke. The figure continued on its path until it melted back into the shadows of the forest, taking that heavy feeling of wrongness with it. But I stayed in that tree for at least another hour, my whole body trembling, before I found the courage to climb down. When my feet finally touched the ground, I ran home faster than I'd ever run in my life. I burst through our front door, hysterical and babbling. My parents tried to calm me down, probably thinking I'd just had a fright from the wolves. I never told them about the figure. I couldn't find the words to describe it without sounding crazy. I quit my job at the shop the next day. No amount of money was worth risking another encounter like that. My father started driving me to and from my new job in town, and I never took that mountain path again. Some folks in town talked about strange footprints found in that area over the years, or livestock that went missing under mysterious circumstances, but I kept quiet about what I saw. It's been over 40 years now, and I've never forgotten that night. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just shadows and fear playing tricks on my mind. But then I remember how those wolves reacted, wild, hungry wolves backing down in terror, and I know what I saw was real. Whatever that thing was, it didn't belong in our world, and I thank God every day that it chose to ignore me up in that tree. I still live in the area, though much closer to town now. On autumn evenings, when the wind blows just right through the trees, I sometimes think I catch that same wild scent on the breeze. When that happens, I make sure all my doors and windows are locked, draw the curtains tight, and pray that dark figure is keeping to the deep woods where it belongs. Story 15. I'm writing this down because I need to get it off my chest. For years, I've only told my wife and closest friend about it, but keeping it bottled up is driving me crazy. Every time I'm in the woods now, I can't help but look over my shoulder. It was early November 2010. The weather had been unusually warm for that time of year, and we had a big contract to clear some land for a new development project. That morning, I decided to get some hunting in before heading to the work site. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a kid with my dad, so I knew every trail and creek like the back of my hand. I parked my truck along County Road 237, an old dirt road that cuts through the densest part of the forest. It was about 5:30 a.m., still dark, but I could see the first hints of dawn breaking through the trees. The air was crisp, and there was this weird silence. You know how sometimes the woods get so quiet it feels unnatural? That's exactly how it was. I grabbed my rifle and started walking down my usual trail. I'd set up a deer stand about a mile in a few weeks earlier, and I was hoping to bag a buck before work. The whole time I was walking, something felt off. Usually you'd hear birds starting to wake up, maybe some rustling in the undergrowth from small animals, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the fallen leaves. About halfway to my stand, I caught this smell. If you've ever worked with cattle or been to a zoo, you know that musky animal smell. But this was different, stronger, more wild. At first, I thought maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but it wasn't quite like that either. That's when I heard it, branches breaking, but not like when a deer moves through the woods. These were big branches, the kind that make loud cracks when they snap. Whatever was making that noise was big, and it was moving parallel to me, maybe 50 yards to my right through the dense undergrowth. My first thought was bear, but we rarely get bears in this part of Ohio. Still, I raised my rifle and switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the pre-dawn darkness, but all I could see were trees and brush. The breaking branches had stopped, but I could feel something watching me. You know that feeling when you're being stared at? Multiply that by 100. I stood completely still, trying to control my breathing, which had gotten heavy and loud. That's when I saw movement on the old logging road about 30 yards ahead of me. What stepped out? I'm still trying to process it 14 years later. This thing was massive. When I say massive, I mean it made a full-grown black bear look like a cub. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were wider than my truck's hood, and it was covered in dark, matted fur. But what really got me were its proportions. They were all wrong for any animal I'd ever seen. It walked upright, but not like a bear does occasionally. This thing walked like a person, but with this fluid, athletic movement that something that size shouldn't have been capable of. I stood there, frozen. My flashlight beam was shaking so bad I could barely keep it steady. The creature stopped in the middle of the road and turned its head toward me. Its eyes caught the light, reflecting back with this reddish-orange glow. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. It was deep, like it came from somewhere in its chest. That sound broke whatever spell had me frozen in place. I started backing up slowly, my rifle still raised, though honestly, I don't think I could have pulled the trigger if I'd needed to. My hands were shaking too bad. The creature watched me retreat for a moment. Then, with one fluid motion, it stepped off the road and into the woods on the other side. The crazy thing is how quiet it was. Something that big should have made noise moving through the brush, but aside from a few branch snaps, it was almost silent. I backed up all the way to my truck, never taking my eyes off the woods. When I finally got in, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sat there for a while, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was just a bear, but I knew better. I'd been in these woods my whole life. I knew what I saw, but that wasn't the end of it. Later that same day, I had to go to work. I seriously considered calling in sick, but I had responsibilities. I was operating an excavator at our logging site, about 5 miles from where I'd had my morning encounter. It was around 2 p.m., and I was clearing some land for the new access road. The work helped take my mind off what had happened that morning. The rhythmic motion of the excavator, the familiar controls under my hands. It was almost therapeutic. But then I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision. About 50 yards away, where we'd already cleared most of the trees but left some undergrowth, I saw movement. At first I thought it was one of the crew, but everyone else was working on the other side of the site. I stopped the excavator and turned to look properly. Standing there, partially hidden behind a young maple tree, was what looked like a smaller version of what I'd seen that morning. This one was maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, with the same dark fur, but its build was slimmer. It was just watching me work. I killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, one hand resting on the maple tree, head slightly tilted like it was curious about what I was doing. I reached for my phone to take a picture, moving as slowly as I could, but the moment I shifted in my seat, it backed away into the thicker brush. I scrambled out of the excavator and ran to where it had been standing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there they were, footprints. They looked almost human, but bigger, wider, with 5 distinct toes. I took pictures of those at least, but they don't really do justice to what I saw. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept scanning the tree line, hoping or maybe dreading that I'd see it again. I told my crew chief I wasn't feeling well and left early. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how that smaller one had watched me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It just seemed interested. For weeks afterward, I kept seeing signs, unusual tracks, broken branches way too high up for any normal animal, and that distinctive smell. But I never saw them directly again. It was like they were letting me know they were still around, but keeping their distance. I've spent countless hours researching since then, trying to make sense of what I saw. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, studied witness accounts, looked at blurry photos and shaky videos. Some people claim they're just bears, others say it's all hoaxes. But I know what I saw that day wasn't either of those things. The weird thing is, I still work in those woods. Every day I go back out there with my crew, operating machinery, cutting trees, clearing land. Sometimes I wonder if they're watching us, trying to understand what we're doing in their territory. I've never felt threatened by them, but I have this deep respect now for the unknown. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know how this sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably would have laughed it off. But I know what I saw, and I know there are things in these woods that we don't understand. The footprints I photographed have faded from my phone. It was an old flip phone back then, and the pictures were terrible quality anyway. But I still have my memories of that day, crystal clear, like it happened yesterday. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I catch that familiar smell or hear branches breaking in that distinctive way, and I know they're still out there watching, living their lives parallel to ours, just out of sight. I still hunt, still work the same jobs, but I do it differently now. I'm more aware, more respectful of the forest. And sometimes, when the woods get unusually quiet and that familiar feeling of being watched creeps over me, I just nod my head in acknowledgement and go about my business. Live and let live, I suppose. That's my story. Take from it what you will. But if you're ever in the forests around Wholesome Valley and you get that feeling of being watched, or catch an unusual musky smell on the breeze, or hear branches breaking too high up in the trees, well, just remember that there might be more to these woods than meets the eye. Story 16. We were both really into quad biking back then. Every weekend we'd take our ATVs out to explore the backwoods of Washington State. That particular day in late September started like any other. We loaded up our quads early in the morning, grabbed some snacks and water, and headed out to 5 Points. The weather was perfect, one of those crisp fall days with clear skies that make you glad to be alive. We'd been riding all day, taking breaks here and there to rest and hydrate. As the afternoon started winding down, we decided to do one last trail before heading home. The sun was getting low, creating that golden hour lighting that photographers love. It must have been around 6 p.m., and we were on this remote trail we'd never explored before. I was leading, with Mike about 50 feet behind me. The trail wasn't particularly challenging, just winding through old-growth forest with plenty of fallen leaves covering the ground. The air had that distinct autumn smell, you know, that mix of damp earth and decaying leaves. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I rounded a bend and saw something that made me slam on my brakes so hard that my quad skidded a bit. About 35-40 feet ahead of me, standing partially behind a massive Douglas fir, was something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. The setting sun was behind us, illuminating whatever it was perfectly. It was huge, I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me. If I had to guess, it was at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe even taller. The first thing that struck me, besides its height, were those shoulders. They were impossibly broad, like a linebacker on steroids, but proportional to its massive frame. The weird thing was, it didn't seem to have a neck. The head just kind of merged into those massive shoulders. The whole body was covered in what looked like dark, matted hair. Not fur like a bear, but more like human hair, just thicker and coarser. I froze completely. My quad was still running, and I could hear Mike's engine getting closer behind me. The creature was just standing there, partially obscured by the tree, but clearly looking right at me. Its eyes reflected the sunlight in a way that made my stomach drop. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. Mike came around the corner and nearly crashed into my quad. "What the hell, Dave?" he started to say, but then he saw it too. I heard his breath catch in his throat. Neither of us said a word. We just sat there on our idling quads, staring at this impossible thing, and it stared right back. The weirdest part? I wasn't terrified. I mean, I was scared, definitely, but there was something else. It felt more like encountering something you're not supposed to see, like accidentally walking in on a secret you were never meant to know about. The creature didn't seem aggressive, but there was an intelligence in those eyes that chilled me to my core. We must have stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Then, without any warning, it moved. And man, the way it moved. That's what really got to me. It didn't lumber like a bear or move awkwardly like a person in a costume. It moved with this fluid grace that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. In 2 massive strides, it disappeared behind the tree and into the denser forest beyond. Mike and I sat there for another minute, engines still running, just trying to process what we'd seen. Finally, Mike broke the silence. Did you see that?" His voice was shaking. I just nodded, unable to find words. We didn't stick around to investigate. By mutual, unspoken agreement, We turned our quads around and got out of there as fast as we safely could. The sun was setting quickly, and neither of us wanted to be in those woods after dark. The ride back to our trucks was tense. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that thing following us. But we didn't see anything else unusual that day. When we finally got back to the parking area, we loaded up our quads in complete silence. It wasn't until we were both in our separate trucks, ready to head home, that we rolled down our windows to talk. "We need to report this," Mike said, but his voice was uncertain. I shook my head. "Who would believe us? We don't have any proof." He agreed, and that was that. We drove home, and for weeks afterward, we hardly talked about it. The thing is, that encounter changed something in us. We still went riding, but never back to that specific area, and we never went out as late in the day again. Something about that experience made us feel like we'd crossed an invisible line, like we'd seen behind a curtain we weren't supposed to pull back. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we saw. Could it have been a bear? No. Bears don't stand like that, and they definitely don't move the way that thing moved. A person in a costume, out there, miles from anywhere, perfectly hidden until we came along. And no costume could replicate that fluid movement, those proportions, those eyes. What really gets me, even now, is how deliberate the whole thing felt. That creature didn't run away immediately like a startled animal would. It stood its ground, observed us, and then chose when to leave. It wasn't afraid of us or our machines. If anything, it felt like it was studying us as much as we were studying it. The local papers didn't report any other sightings in that area that year. Mike and I never went public with our story. Who would believe two guys on quads who didn't have any evidence? But I know what I saw. That image is burned into my memory. The massive shoulders, the absent neck, those intelligent eyes reflecting the sunset. I've read other people's encounters over the years, and many details match up with what we saw. The height, the build, the way it moved. It's eerily similar to other reports. But reading about it is one thing. Seeing it in person is something else entirely. It's like the difference between reading about swimming and actually being thrown into deep water. Sometimes I dream about it. Not nightmare-style dreams where it's chasing me or anything like that. Just dreams where I'm back on that trail, having that moment of eye contact with something that shouldn't exist. I wake up from those dreams with this overwhelming sense of, I don't know, maybe privilege. Like I was allowed to see something few people ever get to see, even if I can never prove it happened. Mike and I don't talk much anymore. Life took us in different directions. But every now and then, usually late at night, I'll get a text from him that just says, "Remember," and I know exactly what he's thinking about. How could either of us forget? I still ride quads sometimes, though not as often as I used to, and every time I'm out in the woods, especially during that golden hour before sunset, I find myself scanning the trees. Part of me hopes to see it again, to validate what happened that day. But another part of me hopes I never do. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some experiences change you in ways you can never quite explain to others. That's my story. I've never shared it publicly before, and I probably won't again. I'm not trying to convince anyone or prove anything. I just needed to tell someone what happened that day in 5 points. Whether you believe me or not doesn't really matter. I know what I saw, and so does Mike, and that's enough for me. Story 17. I had picked a secluded spot near Crystal Springs, Oklahoma, for what was supposed to be a weekend of peaceful fishing. The weather was perfect. Crisp autumn air, clear skies, and the kind of silence you can only find deep in nature. I arrived around 2 p.m. on Friday and set up my camp about 50 yards from the creek. Nothing fancy, just my trusty 2-person tent, a small fire pit, and my fishing gear. I've always preferred camping alone. There's something therapeutic about disconnecting from the world and just focusing on the simplicity of survival and fishing. The first signs that something was off started around sunset. I was cleaning the 2 bass I'd caught for dinner when I noticed the birds had gone completely quiet. If you spend enough time outdoors, you know that sudden animal silence usually means something's wrong. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe a hawk was passing through. As darkness fell, I got my fire going and started cooking my fish. That's when I heard it. A whistle from somewhere in the trees behind my camp. At first, I thought it might be another camper trying to get my attention, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of whistle a person makes. It was more like someone trying to imitate a whistle, but not quite getting it right. Too drawn out and with weird fluctuations in pitch. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" No response, just more silence. Then another whistle, this time from a different direction, maybe 100 yards to my left. My heart started beating faster. I've heard all kinds of animals in the woods, but this was different. It felt deliberate, almost like it was testing my reaction. I decided to stay close to my fire and keep it burning bright. As I sat there trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid, I heard what I can only describe as knocking sounds, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. 3 distinct knocks, pause, then 3 more. The sound seemed to move around the perimeter of my camp, never coming from the same spot twice. Around 10 p.m. things escalated. I was inside my tent, trying to distract myself by reading on my phone, when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the leaves. Heavy footsteps, not like a deer or coyote. Whatever it was big, and it was walking on 2 feet. The steps would stop for a while, then start again, always staying just at the edge of where my lantern light reached. But what really made my blood run cold was when I heard the voices. Not clear speech, but something trying to mimic human voices, like when you hear people talking in the distance and can't make out the words, except these sounds were all wrong. The pitch was too deep, the cadence unnatural. It was like listening to someone play a warped recording of human speech. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sounds, and that's when I saw something that still makes me question my sanity. About 40 yards away, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a massive shoulder and the side of a head covered in dark hair. The creature must have been at least 8 feet tall, because its head was level with a branch I later measured at that height. The moment my light hit it, everything went dead quiet. No more footsteps, no more knocks, no more weird voice sounds, just absolute silence. I kept my light trained on that spot, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight steady. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, I heard a deep, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a breath. And whatever it was, moved behind the tree with surprisingly little noise for its size. I'd love to say I was brave enough to investigate, but that would be a lie. I spent the next several hours sitting in my tent, every muscle tense, my hunting knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I kept hearing movement in the woods, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but it always stayed just out of sight. The worst part came around 3 a.m. I heard something big circling my tent, so close I could hear its breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breaths, definitely not human, but also not like any animal I'd ever encountered. It circled my tent 3 times, each circuit taking exactly the same amount of time, like it was deliberately pacing. The footsteps were methodical, calculated. This wasn't some curious animal. Whatever this thing was, it was intelligent. I was sure I was about to die. I kept thinking about how they'd find my campsite, how they'd probably blame it on a bear attack. But then the strangest thing happened. It just left. The footsteps moved away into the forest, accompanied by two short whistles that seemed to be answered by something further away. Then, nothing. I waited until the first light of dawn before I moved. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent, the morning looked completely normal. Birds were singing, squirrels were chattering. It was like nothing had happened. But the evidence was there. All around my campsite, I found massive footprints, bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The weird thing was, they didn't look exactly like the Bigfoot prints you see in photos or documentaries. They were more natural, if that makes sense. Not perfectly formed like the hoaxed ones you see online. What really convinced me this wasn't just my imagination was the trees. Several of them had fresh bark damage about 8 feet up, consistent with where I'd seen that massive shape the night before. And in one spot, I found weird hair caught in some tree bark. Thick, coarse hair that wasn't from any animal I could identify. I packed up my camp in record time and got out of there. I've never gone back to Crystal Springs, and I haven't gone camping alone since. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what happened. There are lots of theories out there about Bigfoot and other cryptids, but none of them quite match what I experienced. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size of what I saw, or even those footprints. It's the intelligence behind it all. The way it systematically tested my reactions with the whistles and knocks. The deliberate way it moved around my camp. The attempt to mimic human voices. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something that thought, planned, and probably watched me long before I knew it was there. I still fish, but never alone anymore, and never in places that remote. Some people have suggested it might have been other campers playing a prank, but I know what I experienced. No human could have moved that quietly at that size, and no costume could have looked that natural in my flashlight beam. I don't expect everyone to believe my story, and honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt that night. Something is out there in our forests that we can't explain, something that's way more intelligent than we give it credit for. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there in Crystal Springs, waiting for the next lonely camper to test its tricks on. Story 18. I'd planned this particular hike for weeks. The weather forecast showed perfect conditions, crisp autumn air, clear skies, and temperatures in the low 60s. I'd done this specific trail many times before, usually taking the high route that overlooks the valley. It's a challenging 12-mile loop that most casual hikers avoid, which is exactly why I love it. I got to the trailhead around 7 a.m. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't unusual for a Thursday morning. I remember checking my gear one last time. Water, trail mix, first aid kit, GPS, the usual stuff. Everything felt normal, routine even. The leaves were just starting to turn, creating that perfect mix of green and gold that makes Ohio forests so beautiful in fall. About 3 hours in, I reached my favorite overlook point. It's this natural rock formation that juts out over the valley, giving you a perfect view of the lower trail that winds through the forest below. I usually stop here for lunch, so I took off my pack and sat down to eat my sandwich. That's when everything changed. At first, it was just movement that caught my eye. Something dark moving along the lower trail about 200 yards below my position. Initially, I assumed it was another hiker, but something felt off about the way it moved. I grabbed my binoculars for a better look, and what I saw made my blood run cold. This thing was walking upright, but not like a human. It was massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. Its gait was smooth but strange, like each step was deliberately placed. What really struck me was how it stayed right at the edge of the trail, almost brushing against the trees, like it was trying to stay partially concealed, even though it was using the open trail. The color was dark, but not pure black, more like a deep brown grey. The fur, yes, fur, wasn't shaggy like you see in those fake Bigfoot videos. It was shorter, almost sleek, especially around what I assume were its shoulders. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. I'm not some conspiracy theorist. I've never believed in cryptids or monsters. I'm the person who always has a logical explanation for weird forest sounds or strange tracks. But sitting there, watching this thing through my binoculars, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold them steady, I knew I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. The creature stopped suddenly, and that's when true fear hit me. It turned its head, not like a person looking around, but more like a predator sensing something. The movement was so quick, so precise. Even from my elevated position, I could tell it was scenting the air. That's when I realized the wind had shifted. It was now blowing from my position down into the valley. What happened next will haunt me forever. The creature's head snapped up, looking directly at my position on the overlook. I dropped to the ground so fast I scraped my elbow on the rock. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, barely breathing, too terrified to look over the edge again. When I finally gathered enough courage to peer over, the thing was gone. But that wasn't reassuring at all. The lower trail was clearly visible for at least a quarter mile in both directions from my vantage point. Something that large couldn't just disappear that quickly, unless it had left the trail and gone into the dense forest. That's when the rational part of my brain finally kicked in, reminding me that I was alone, on a rarely used trail, and whatever I'd seen had been moving with purpose. I needed to get out of there. But here's the problem. The loop trail I was on would eventually connect with that lower trail. If I continued forward, I'd have to pass the exact spot where I'd seen the creature. If I went back, I'd have to retrace my steps through several switchbacks that cut through dense forest. I chose to go back. It was longer, but at least I knew the path was clear behind me. I've never packed up my gear so quickly in my life. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest that had felt so familiar just hours ago now felt alien and threatening. The hike back was the most terrifying 2 hours of my life. I didn't stop once. No water breaks, no rest. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the trees, stopping to listen every few minutes. The worst part was the silence. Usually these woods are full of bird calls and small animal sounds, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. About halfway back, I heard something that made me freeze, a deep, resonant sound, unlike anything I've ever heard in nature. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a howl. It was deeper, more guttural, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was distant, but that didn't matter. I ran. I don't care how stupid that is when you're on a mountain trail. I ran. I made it back to my car without seeing anything else, but the feeling of being watched never left me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys into the ignition. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were now 2 other cars in the lot. I think about those hikers sometimes, wonder if they experienced anything strange that day. It's been over 4 years, and I still haven't gone back to Shawnee. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that part of Ohio. I've tried to convince myself that what I saw had a logical explanation. A bear walking upright, some guy in a costume, though that makes no sense given the location and how it moved. Or maybe some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I know what I saw. The thing that really gets me, the detail that makes me question everything I thought I knew about our world, is how it moved. No costume could replicate that fluid, predatory movement. No bear can turn its head with that kind of precision or move with that kind of purposeful stealth. Whatever I saw that day was intelligent, aware, and definitely not something science has acknowledged exists. I've never reported this officially. Who would I even tell? The Park Service? The police? I'd sound crazy. But I know what I saw, and I know there are things in our forests that we can't explain. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself looking at maps of Shawnee State Forest, tracing that trail with my finger, wondering if anyone else has seen what I saw. Wondering if it's still out there, walking those trails, staying just at the edge of visibility. The worst part isn't the fear or the uncertainty, it's the knowing. Knowing that our world is not what we think it is, that there are things out there we can't explain, and that sometimes if we're lucky or unlucky enough, we catch a glimpse of them. And once you see something like that, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to believing the world is exactly what they tell you it is. I still have the binoculars I used that day. Sometimes I think about getting rid of them, but I keep them as a reminder that what I saw was real. They're my only proof, even though they didn't capture any images. They're the tools that gave me a clear view of something impossible, something that changed my understanding of reality forever. If you're hiking in Shawnee State Forest, especially on the more remote trails, stay alert. Watch the edges of the trails, listen to the silence, and pay attention to when the birds stop singing. And if you get that feeling, that deep, primal feeling that something is watching you, trust it. Because sometimes, just sometimes, there really is something out there in the woods, something that we're not supposed to see, something that defies everything we think we know about what's real and what isn't. Story 19. We moved to our property back in '98 when I was just starting high school. It was a beautiful 15-acre plot with woods backing up to state land, about 30 minutes outside of Chillicothe. My parents thought it would be perfect. Enough space for my little sister Sarah, who was 7 at the time, to grow up with room to play, and close enough to town that my mum could keep her job at the local clinic. The first few months were completely normal. We had 2 dogs, an old German shepherd named Max and a young border collie named Ruby. They were outdoor dogs with a big fenced area and decent shelter. But around November that year, things started getting weird. It began with the dogs acting strange. They'd bark at nothing in the middle of the night, which isn't that unusual for dogs, but this was different. They'd both stare at the exact same spot in the tree line, hackles raised, making these low growls I'd never heard before. Sometimes they'd suddenly stop barking and just whimper, retreating to their doghouse even on mild nights. Then Ruby disappeared, just gone one morning. The gate was still latched, no holes in the fence, nothing. My dad spent days putting up lost dog posters and driving around the area calling for her. We never found her. Max was different after that. He'd refuse to go out at night, even to do his business. He'd scratch at the door to come inside, something he'd never done before. The sounds started in early '99. At first we tried to rationalize them. Coyotes, owls, maybe even a mountain lion, though they weren't supposed to be in our area. But these sounds, they were like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. Deep, resonant whoops that would echo through the trees, followed by what sounded almost like wood knocking against wood. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like a baby crying, but distorted, coming from deep in the woods. My parents tried to keep things normal, especially for Sarah's sake. But we all noticed things. Tools would go missing from the shed, only to turn up in weird places days later. We'd find strange prints in the mud after rain. Way too big to be human, with 5 distinct toes, but not quite like any animal track we knew. The game cameras my dad put up would either catch nothing or end up turned around facing the trees. But the really intense stuff started happening around Sarah. She'd always been a quiet kid, kind of in her own world, but she started talking about her forest friends. At first, we thought it was just typical kid stuff, an imagination running wild. But then she started knowing things she shouldn't have known. One morning in 2000, she came to breakfast and told us exactly where to find Max's old collar that had been missing for months, buried under a specific fallen log about 200 yards into the woods. My dad went to check, more to humor her than anything else. He came back white as a sheet, holding the muddy collar. Sarah started spending more time near the wood's edge, but never going in. She'd sit on this old stump and talk, sometimes in English, sometimes in these weird sounds that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We'd hear responses, soft whoops or knocks coming from just inside the tree line. My mom wanted to stop her, but our family doctor said it was just a phase, and as long as she wasn't going into the woods alone, we should let her process things her own way. The activity seemed to peak around 2002-2003. We'd wake up to find bizarre arrangements of sticks and stones on our property, not random, clearly arranged in patterns, often in perfect geometric shapes that couldn't have happened naturally. The smell was the worst part. This powerful, musky odor that would come and go, so strong it would make your eyes water. Sometimes it was accompanied by this feeling of being watched that was so intense you could practically feel it physically. I remember one night in particular, around summer 2003. The power had gone out during a storm, and we were all in the living room with candles lit. Through the French doors leading to the back deck, we all saw it. A massive, dark shape, easily 8 feet tall, just standing there in the rain. The candlelight reflected off its eyes, giving them this reddish glow. None of us moved or spoke for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah just whispered, "They're scared of the storm too." The next morning, we found massive footprints in the mud all around the house, and these weird markings scraped into the bark of trees at the forest's edge. My dad took photos and measurements, but like an idiot teenager, I was so freaked out that I later deleted them from the digital camera, thinking somehow that erasing the evidence would make it all go away. Max died in early 2004. Just old age, nothing mysterious. After that, the activity seemed to change. Less threatening somehow, but still intense. We'd find berries or interesting rocks left on the back porch. Once, after Sarah had been sick with the flu, we found what looked like medicinal herbs. My mum's a nurse and recognized some of them as having actual medicinal properties. Sarah's conversations with whatever was out there continued, but she became more secretive about them. When we'd ask, she'd just say they were sad about something changing in the forest. Looking back, that was around the time they started clearing land a few miles away for new development. The last major incident was in late 2005. Sarah, now 14, was doing homework on the deck one afternoon while I was home from college for the weekend. I was in the kitchen and heard her speaking in that weird language again. When I looked out, I saw 3 dark figures just within the tree line. They were huge, covered in what looked like dark hair, but standing upright like humans. I grabbed my phone to take a picture, but it malfunctioned, just showed static and turned off. The figures made these soft whooping sounds, almost musical, and Sarah responded in kind. Then they just melted back into the forest. Sarah came inside crying. When I asked her what was wrong, she just said, "They're leaving. They have to go somewhere safer." That was the last time we had any significant activity on the property. We still live here, though my parents are talking about selling now that they're getting older. Sarah's away at college studying wildlife biology, if you can believe it. She doesn't talk about those years much anymore, but sometimes when she's home visiting, I catch her sitting on that old stump, looking into the woods with this knowing expression. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was mass hysteria, Maybe we were all stressed from the move and seeing things that weren't there. But then I remember the footprints, the sounds, that smell, and those eyes in the darkness. And I know what we experienced was real, even if I can't explain it. The woods are different now, quieter. The development eventually reached within a mile of our property. Whatever was out there, whatever formed that strange connection with my little sister, it's gone now. But sometimes, on really quiet nights, we still hear distant whoops echoing from deep in the forest, like they're calling out to someone who's no longer there to answer. I've never posted about this before, and I probably won't again. But I needed to share it, to put it somewhere outside my own head. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't believe it either. But every word I've written is true, as best as I can remember it. Make of it what you will. Story 20. Being twins, Tom and I were inseparable, and we spent most of our free time exploring the woods behind our property. Our favorite spot was this secluded creek, about a mile into the forest. It wasn't much, just a gentle stream, really. But it was deep enough in some spots to hold decent-sized fish, and that's all that mattered to us back then. We'd discovered this perfect fishing hole, where the creek bent around some large rocks. The water pooled there, creating this calm area where catfish would gather. We'd go there almost every day after our chores, carrying our homemade fishing poles and a tin can full of worms we'd dig up from Mom's garden. It was early June when things started getting strange. I remember because school had just let out for summer, and we were finally free to spend whole days at the creek. The first time we noticed something was off. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour. I was focused on my line, watching it drift in the current, when I got this weird feeling. You know, that sensation when you just know someone's watching you. I looked up, expecting to see maybe a deer or even one of the neighbor kids who sometimes followed us around. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. On the other side of the creek, partially hidden behind a young oak tree, was, well, I'm still not sure exactly what it was. It looked like a kid about our size, but something was off. Its proportions weren't quite right, and its face, I couldn't make out its features clearly, but I knew instantly it wasn't human. Tom noticed my sudden stillness and followed my gaze. When he saw it, he grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. We both just froze there, our fishing poles forgotten. The creature didn't move either. It just stood there, watching us with what I can only describe as curiosity. Its head was slightly cocked to one side, like a dog trying to understand something. What struck me most was its eyes. They were dark, but not in a scary way. They seemed intelligent. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, it took a step back and disappeared into the undergrowth. Tom and I looked at each other, grabbed our stuff, and ran all the way home. That night, we argued about whether to tell our parents. We decided against it. Who'd believe us? Besides, despite our initial fear, the creature hadn't done anything threatening. It had just watched. The next day, after much debate, we went back. Part of me thinks we were crazy to return, but we were curious kids and nothing bad had happened. Plus, it was our spot. We'd been fishing there for 2 years, and we weren't about to give it up. The creature showed up again, this time standing a bit closer. It still kept to the other side of the creek, but now we could see it better. Its body was covered in what looked like short, dark hair, and its movements were surprisingly graceful for something that seemed so out of place. It watched us fish for about an hour, occasionally shifting its weight or taking a small step, but never making any aggressive moves. This pattern continued throughout June and into July. Every few days our strange companion would appear. Sometimes it would stay for hours, other times just a few minutes. We started to notice it would imitate our movements, If we sat down, it would sit. If we threw a line into the water, it would make a throwing motion with its arm. One particularly hot afternoon, Tom decided to try something. He had brought an extra apple with his lunch, and with trembling hands, he rolled it across the creek toward the creature. It approached the apple cautiously, picked it up with surprisingly delicate movements, and sniffed it. Then, mimicking how we ate, it took a bite. After that day, we always brought an extra piece of fruit or a sandwich. The creature, we started calling it Shadow, because of how it would always stay in the shadowy parts of the woods, seemed to become more comfortable with us. It would sometimes come right up to the creek's edge, though it never crossed to our side. We could see its features better then. Its face was oddly flat, with a broad nose and deep-set eyes that seemed too knowing for a wild animal. What amazes me most, looking back, is how quickly we accepted this impossible situation as normal. Kids are adaptable, I guess. We had our own secret friend that no one else knew about, and that made it special. But everything changed in late August. We arrived at the creek one morning to find the area completely torn up. The ground was covered in deep scratches, and several small trees had been uprooted. There were huge footprints everywhere, much bigger than Shadow's, and we could hear deep, guttural noises coming from deep in the woods. Shadow appeared suddenly, moving more frantically than we'd ever seen. It made urgent gestures for us to leave, repeatedly pointing back toward our house. Then we heard it, heavy footsteps and the sound of breaking branches getting closer. Shadow's eyes went wide with what looked like fear, and it quickly disappeared into the forest, moving away from the approaching sounds. We ran home faster than we ever had before. When we returned the next day, the area was quiet. Shadow never appeared again. We kept going back for weeks, hoping to see our strange friend, but the creek remained empty except for the fish. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would believe this story. Tom and I are in our 80s now, and we still talk about that summer. We've read about other encounters people have had with similar creatures, but none quite like ours. Most stories involve fear and running away, but our experience was different. We had somehow befriended what I now believe was a young Bigfoot, and something, probably its family or others of its kind, had forced it to leave. I've gone back to that creek a few times over the years. The fishing hole is still there, though the surrounding woods have changed. Every time I visit, I find myself looking across the water, half expecting to see a familiar shadow watching from behind a tree. The mystery of what exactly happened that summer has never left me, and I doubt it ever will. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder about Shadow, where it went, if it remembered us, and if it ever had the chance to share its strange friendship with two human boys with others of its kind. The experience changed how I view the world. It taught me that there are things out there we can't explain, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. But most importantly, it showed me that sometimes the most extraordinary encounters can come from simply being open to the impossible. Story 21. That day started like any other summer day. It was late July, and the air was thick with humidity. I remember wearing my favorite red t-shirt and these old rubber boots my dad had given me for my birthday. I had my fishing pole and a small bucket for the frogs. Mum had told me to be back before dark, but I wasn't worried. I knew that swamp like the back of my hand. I got there around 4 p.m. The sun was still high, but the thick canopy of trees made everything feel darker than it actually was. The mosquitoes were brutal that day, but I didn't care. I was determined to catch some bullfrogs. They always made the best noise at dusk. I had been there for maybe an hour, had caught 3 decent-sized frogs, when something changed. It's hard to explain, but you know how sometimes you can feel when something's not right. The swamp had this constant background noise, frogs croaking, birds chirping, insects buzzing. But suddenly, everything got quiet. Not gradually quiet, but like someone had hit a mute button. Even the mosquitoes stopped buzzing around my head. At first, I thought maybe a hawk was nearby. Animals often go quiet when there's a predator around. But this was different. The silence was absolute, and it felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. That's when I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. I remember my heart starting to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed completely still, my fishing pole forgotten in my hands. The water in front of me was perfectly still, not even a ripple. Then I heard it, a sound I've never been able to fully describe to anyone. It was like a deep breath, but not quite human. It came from somewhere in the thick vegetation to my left, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear wasn't like anything I'd felt before, not like when you watch a scary movie or when you think there's a monster under your bed. This was primal, like my body knew something my mind couldn't comprehend. Then the branches started moving, not like when a deer pushes through. This was deliberate. I could see something large shifting behind the cattails and marsh grass. The movement created this weird pattern, like waves in the vegetation, but too high up to be any animal I knew. That's when I saw it. Not all at once, but in pieces. First, a massive shoulder, darker than the shadows around it, pushing aside a small tree like it was nothing. Then a head emerged, so tall it was almost level with the lower branches of the surrounding trees. The thing must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, and its face. God, its face. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. The eyes were what got me, deep-set and intelligent, a dark amber color that seemed to glow in the dimness of the swamp. I remember dropping my fishing pole. It made a small splash when it hit the water, but I barely heard it. My whole world had narrowed down to this creature standing there, looking at me. The weird thing was, once I could see it clearly, the blind panic started to fade. Don't get me wrong, I was still terrified, but something else was happening too. It's hard to explain without sounding crazy, but I felt this presence in my mind. Not words exactly, but feelings. Calm, curiosity. There was no aggression, no threat. The creature just stood there, swaying slightly, its massive head tilted as it studied me. I had this overwhelming sense that it was just as interested in me as I was in it. We must have stayed like that for several minutes, though it felt like hours. Neither of us moved. I remember noticing details that seem absurd now, like how its hands had opposable thumbs, or how its breathing made its chest rise and fall in a very human-like way. The smell, too. Everyone always talks about a horrible smell with these encounters, but what I remember was more like wet earth and old leaves, mixed with something musky but not unpleasant. Then something crashed in the woods behind me, probably a fallen branch or a startled animal. I jumped and spun around, my heart racing again. When I looked back, the creature was already moving away. It didn't crash through the undergrowth or run. It just seemed to melt back into the shadows, each movement perfectly calculated to avoid breaking branches or making noise. The last thing I saw was its face, turning to look at me one more time before disappearing completely. As soon as it was gone, all the normal swamp sounds came rushing back, like someone had turned the volume back up. Frogs started croaking again, birds resumed their evening songs, and mosquitoes found their way back to my exposed arms. I grabbed my bucket with the frogs still in it and ran all the way home, my rubber boots squelching with every step. I burst through our back door, out of breath and probably white as a sheet. Mom took one look at me and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't tell her. I just said I got spooked by a noise in the swamp. What else could I say? Who would believe me? That night I lay in bed trying to make sense of what had happened. I kept thinking about those eyes, that feeling of connection. It wasn't scary anymore when I thought about it. It was almost peaceful. I went back to that swamp hundreds of times over the next few years before we moved away, but I never saw the creature again. Sometimes, though, on really quiet evenings, I'd get that familiar feeling of being watched. It never felt threatening, more like checking in on an old friend. I've read about other people's encounters since then, especially in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Some stories sound similar to mine, but many are different, violent or frightening. I can only speak to what I experienced. Whatever I saw that day, it wasn't the monster people make these creatures out to be. It was intelligent, curious, and somehow gentle. I'm 65 now, and I've never been able to explain what happened that day. I've told this story maybe 3 times in my entire life. Most people probably think I imagined it or made it up. Maybe I did. The mind can play tricks on you, especially when you're young. But I still remember those eyes, that feeling of connection, the absolute silence of the swamp. Sometimes when I'm out in nature, I still get that feeling of being watched. And you know what? It doesn't scare me anymore. If anything, it makes me feel like I'm not alone, like I'm part of something bigger than myself that I'll never fully understand. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day, and more importantly, I know what I felt. Whatever it was, it changed how I see the world. There are things out there we can't explain, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get a glimpse of them. Story 22. I've been fishing in Bradley Bayou, Arkansas for over 15 years now, and what happened to me last summer still gives me chills every time I think about it. I'm sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has experienced something similar. It was mid-July 2022, during one of my regular weekend fishing trips. I'd found this secluded spot years ago, about 2 miles off the main road, where the fishing was always good. The place is pretty remote. You have to drive down this old dirt road and then hike another half-mile through dense woods to reach the water. I'd camped there dozens of times before without any issues. That day started normal enough. I arrived around 2 p.m., set up my tent about 50 feet from the water's edge, and got my gear ready. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-80s, typical Arkansas summer day. I remember checking my phone and seeing I had barely any signal, which was usual for that area. I wasn't worried, though. I'd done this countless times. The afternoon went great. I caught several nice-sized bass and even a decent catfish. As the sun started setting, I got my campfire going and cleaned the fish I wanted to keep. That's when I first noticed something was off. The woods got quiet, and I mean absolutely silent. If you spend time outdoors, you know how unnatural that feels. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a coyote was passing through, I thought. Around 9 p.m. I was sitting by the fire, having just finished eating, when I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps in the woods behind my tent. Not like a deer or bear. These were bipedal steps, slow and deliberate. I froze. The steps circled around my campsite, staying just beyond where my firelight reached. Whatever it was big, and it was trying to stay hidden in the shadows. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the tree line. The footsteps stopped. That's when I heard the breathing, deep, heavy breathing, like something massive trying to be quiet, but couldn't quite manage it. It came from about 30 feet away, just behind a thick cluster of trees. I called out, "Hello? Someone there?" No response, just that breathing. Then it started. The wood knocks. 3 distinct knocks, like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat, coming from the direction of the breathing. What made my blood run cold was when another set of knocks answered from the opposite direction, maybe 100 yards away. Then a third set came from somewhere else. I was surrounded. The knocks were followed by what I can only describe as vocalizations. Not animal sounds I've ever heard, and I've heard plenty of wildlife over the years. These were structured, complex, like they were communicating. It started with a low, rumbling call from the closest one, almost like a person trying to imitate a whale song, but deeper and more guttural. The others responded with similar calls, each slightly different in pitch and pattern. I stood there, frozen, as these things called back and forth to each other. The calls got more varied. Some were those deep rumbles, others were higher-pitched whoops, and occasionally there'd be this weird, almost melodic howl that would last for several seconds. They weren't random noises. There was a clear pattern, like they were having a conversation. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. The breathing from the closest one got heavier, and I could hear movement in the underbrush, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Whatever it was huge. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The scariest moment came when I heard something large moving through the water behind me. I spun around and saw ripples in the bayou, like something massive had just walked through it. The water was dark, but in the moonlight I could see the ripples moving in a straight line, like whatever it was walked across on two legs. Around this time, my fire started dying down. I had more firewood, but it was stacked about 15 feet away, and there was no way I was leaving the immediate area around my fire. I used my flashlight to check my watch, 10:47 p.m. The vocalizations continued, sometimes getting closer, sometimes further away, but they never stopped completely. Then one of them threw something. I heard it whistle through the air before it splashed into the water near my fishing spot. When I shined my light over there, I saw ripples from whatever had been thrown, but couldn't see what it was. This happened 3 more times over the next hour, objects being thrown into the water or landing in the brush near my camp. Around midnight, the closest one moved. I heard the footsteps clearly, slow, heavy steps moving away from my campsite. The vocalizations started to fade too, moving deeper into the woods. By 1 a.m. the woods were quiet again, but not the unnatural silence from before. I could hear crickets and frogs again. I stayed awake all night, keeping my fire going with what wood I had left. When dawn finally came, I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. As I was breaking down my tent, I found footprints in the soft ground nearby. They were human-like but massive, easily 16 inches long and incredibly wide. There were broken branches on some of the trees around my campsite, broken at heights I couldn't reach, and I'm 6'2". I haven't been back to that spot since, and I probably never will. I've been an outdoorsman all my life, and I've never experienced anything like that night. The way they moved, the way they communicated, the intelligence behind their actions. They were coordinating, testing my reactions, maybe even trying to intimidate me into leaving. The weirdest part? When I got home and checked my phone's voice recorder, I'd started recording when the knocks began, there was nothing but static. Not even the sound of the fire crackling or water moving. Just static, like something was interfering with the recording. I still go fishing, but never alone anymore, and never in places that remote. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear those vocalizations in my head, that deep, rumbling call, followed by the responses, like they were talking to each other about me. I don't know what they were, but they were definitely intelligent, and they definitely wanted me to know they were there. I've told this story to a few close friends, and most of them think I'm crazy or was just spooked by normal forest sounds. But I know what I heard and saw that night. Something was out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. And the scariest part is knowing they're still out there, probably watching other campers just like they watched me. Story 23. We'd heard about this conservation area about 45 minutes outside the city that was supposed to have great bass fishing. The place was pretty remote. You had to drive down this narrow gravel road for about 2 miles just to reach the parking area, and then hike another half-mile to get to the actual fishing spots. We got there early, around 5:30 a.m., while it was still dark. The air was crisp, and there was this light fog hanging over everything. The conservation area was heavily wooded, mostly oak and hickory trees. The leaves were starting to turn, creating this carpet of orange and brown on the ground. We found this perfect spot where a fallen tree created a natural fishing platform jutting out into the water. The lake itself wasn't huge, maybe 30 acres, but it was deep and supposedly well stocked. Everything was normal for the first few hours. We caught a couple of decent-sized bass, nothing spectacular, but enough to keep us interested. Around 10 a.m. things started getting weird. I remember checking my watch because that's when we were planning to break for an early lunch. The first thing we noticed was the silence. If you spend any time outdoors, you know how nature has this constant background noise, birds, insects, wind in the trees, but suddenly everything just stopped. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the whole forest. Mike noticed it too. I saw him look up from his line with this confused expression. That's when the rocks started hitting the water, not being thrown directly at us, but landing maybe 15-20 feet away, creating these big splashes. At first I thought it might be some kids messing with us, but we were pretty deep in the conservation area, and we hadn't seen another soul all morning. Plus, these rocks were big. We could hear them hitting tree branches on their way down. I remember saying something like, maybe we should pack it up, but Mike wanted to investigate. He thought it might be some animal knocking rocks loose from the hillside behind us. That's when we heard the branch snap, not like a twig breaking under someone's foot, but like the sound of a baseball bat cracking. It came from the tree line about 50 yards behind us. We both turned around so fast we nearly fell into the water. The fog had lifted by then, but the forest was dense enough that visibility was still limited. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Between 2 large oak trees, maybe 40 yards away, there was this figure. I say figure because my brain couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. It was tall, impossibly tall. Later, when we talked about it, Mike and I compared the height to the trees it was standing between, and we figured it had to be at least 8 feet tall. But it wasn't just the height that was unsettling. This thing was massive in every dimension. Its shoulders must have been twice as wide as a normal person's. The detail that sticks with me the most, the one that keeps me up at night sometimes, is how it moved. When it shifted its weight, it was too fluid for something that size. Nothing that big should be able to move that smoothly. It was like watching a shadow flow between the trees. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. It was deep enough that I swear I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. That's when Mike whispered, "Run." We didn't even grab our gear, just turned and started sprinting back toward the trail. I've never run so fast in my life. The whole time, we could hear movement in the woods parallel to us. Branches breaking, leaves crunching, but it always stayed just out of sight. The really terrifying part. Whatever it was, it could have easily caught us. It was pacing us, staying just inside the tree line as we ran down the trail. Sometimes it would crash through the brush closer to us, and we'd push ourselves to run faster, but it never quite caught up. Looking back, it feels like it was herding us out of its territory. We made it back to the car, jumped in, and peeled out of there so fast we left rubber on the gravel. Neither of us said a word for the first 20 minutes of the drive. When we finally started talking about it, we couldn't make sense of what we'd seen. We went back the next day with a couple of other friends to retrieve our fishing gear, but everything was gone, not just moved or scattered, completely gone. Rods, tackle boxes, even the cooler with our lunch in it. Never found any of it. I've been back to that conservation area exactly once since then, in broad daylight with a group of people. Everything looked different, smaller, more ordinary. But I noticed something that still bothers me. The 2 oak trees where we saw the figure. The space between them wasn't more than 7 feet wide. Whatever we saw that day had to turn sideways to fit between them. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of mass hallucination. Maybe someone in a costume, though that doesn't explain the strength it would take to throw those rocks or the speed at which it moved. I've read about similar encounters in the area, but I've never shared my story until now. For years, I told myself it was better to keep quiet than have people think I was crazy. Sometimes when I'm fishing in other places, I'll hear a branch snap in the distance or a rock splash in the water, and I'll feel that same primal fear wash over me. Mike doesn't fish anymore. He sold all his gear the week after it happened and took up golf instead. Can't say I blame him. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before it happened, I wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw that day. More importantly, I know what I felt. That deep, instinctual fear that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong with what you're looking at. The kind of fear that bypasses your rational mind and kicks your survival instincts into overdrive. The weirdest part, even after all these years, even after all the times I've replayed that day in my mind, I still can't give you a detailed description of what it looked like. It's like my brain refuses to fully process what I saw. All I can remember clearly is the height, the fluid movement, and this overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. I still fish, but never alone, and never in that conservation area. Some places you just learn to stay away from. Some questions are better left unanswered.